Clara Whitlock threw open the kitchen door at 4:30 in the morning and stepped barefoot into the Montana cold, and what she saw in that sky made her stomach drop straight to the frozen ground. Nobody was awake to see her standing there. Nobody was awake to see the way her breath went shallow, the way her hands gripped the doorframe hard enough to leave marks in the wood. Nobody ever was. That was the thing about being the cook. You could stand right in the middle of a room full of men and be completely, utterly invisible. But that sky. Lord have mercy, that sky. She'd seen skies like that before. Once when she was 19 years old and newly married, standing on a porch in Wyoming, with her husband, James's hand in hers. Once 6 years later, when James was already 3 years in the ground, and she was running a kitchen in Idaho for a cattle outfit that didn't know her name either. Each time that sky had meant the same thing. Each time it had delivered exactly what it promised. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and went back inside to start the biscuits. Her hands moved through the flour and lard without her eyes having to watch them. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. Her mind was counting. Days of provisions, gallons of water, cords of firewood stacked against the south wall of the barn. The number of men sleeping in the bunkhouse right now who had no idea what was coming. 14 men. 4 horses she'd need to worry about getting indoors. Somewhere between 40 and 50 head of cattle spread across the eastern pasture without a lick of shelter between them and whatever that sky was about to deliver. She flipped the first round of biscuits and went to the window and looked out again. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees since midnight. She knew because she'd been awake since midnight. She knew because she checked. She knew because that was what she did. She paid attention to things that didn't concern her according to everyone else at Blackstone Ranch. The foreman's name was Roy Hatch, and he would not listen to her. She already knew that without trying. She'd worked at Blackstone Ranch for 11 months, and in 11 months Roy Hatch had spoken to her directly, exactly 4 times. Once to tell her the coffee was too weak. Once to ask if there were any more biscuits. Once to tell her one of the hands had a peanut allergy she needed to remember. Once to tell her that her predecessor had made a better gravy, and he hoped she'd work on that. That was the full extent of their relationship. She thought about Walt Decker, the old ranch hand who sometimes sat at the end of the kitchen table in the early mornings when nobody else was around, drinking his coffee slowly and not saying much. Walt was 62 years old and had been working cattle ranches since before most of the men at Blackstone were born. Walt had crow's feet so deep they looked carved. Walt had hands that had been broken and healed so many times the knuckles sat crooked on both sides. Walt would listen. Maybe. She slid the biscuits onto the warming rack and started the eggs. By the time the men started filtering in for breakfast at 6, she'd made her decision. She would say something. She would say it plainly, and she would say it once, and if nobody listened, she would deal with that too. She'd been dealing with not being listened to for most of her 40 years on this earth. One more morning wasn't going to break her. Roy Hatch came in first the way he always did, and poured himself coffee without looking at her, and sat down at the head of the long table and opened the logbook he carried everywhere. "Mr. Hatch," Clara said from the stove. He didn't look up. "Mr. Hatch, I need to speak with you about something important." He turned a page in the logbook. "Mr. Hatch." Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was one of the things people used against her without realizing it. She never raised it, so they never heard it. And then they could say she'd never spoken at all. Roy Hatch looked up. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time, and was mildly surprised she could form words. "What is it?" "There's a storm coming," Clara said. "A bad one. I'd put it arriving sometime tonight, possibly early tomorrow morning. The temperature's already dropped 8 degrees since midnight, and the horses have been restless since before dawn. The sky to the northwest." "Clara." His voice wasn't unkind. That almost made it worse. "I appreciate the concern, but we've had cold snaps before. The hands know what to do. This isn't a cold snap, Mr. Hatch. I've seen skies like this twice before in my life. Both times. I'll keep an eye on things," he said, and looked back down at his logbook. That was that. The men came in one by one, and she served them, and they ate and talked around her the way they always did, like she was part of the furniture, like her hands delivering food to the table were just an extension of the table itself. Pete Galloway, 22 years old. Broad through the shoulders, thought he knew everything there was to know about cattle and weather, and women looked up at her when she refilled his coffee and gave her a grin that was friendly enough, but held something dismissive underneath it. "Heard you think we got a storm coming, Miss Clara." "That's right," she said. He glanced at the other men, that grin going a little wider. "My grandmother used to predict storms by how her knees felt." The men laughed. Not cruelly. Just the way young men laugh when they're comfortable and warm and have never had the thing they were laughing about come true in a way that cost them something real. Clara set the coffee pot back on the stove and didn't say another word. She was halfway through the breakfast dishes when Walt Decker came in. He always came in late after the others had cleared out and sat at the far end of the table and drank 2 full cups before he moved again. She poured one for him without being asked. "Heard what you said to Roy," he said. She kept washing dishes. And the sky to the northwest looks like a bad dream." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "How long you figure we got?" She stopped washing. She turned around and looked at him. 12 hours. Maybe 14 if we're lucky." Walt nodded slowly. He turned the cup in his hands. "What do you need done?" That was the moment. Right there. Those 5 words from a 62-year-old man with broken knuckles and a cup of black coffee. That was the moment that changed everything about what happened next. "Cattle need to come in off the eastern pasture," she said immediately, because she'd had the list memorized since 4:30 that morning. "There's a canyon on the south end of that pasture. It's got 3 walls of rock, and the 4th faces east away from where this storm's going to hit. We move the cattle there. They've got a fighting chance. We leave them where they are, we lose most of them. Roy won't authorize a cattle drive on a clear morning. I know that. So how do you want to handle it?" She picked up a dish and dried it carefully before she answered. "Tell him you want to do a routine pasture check. Take 2 or 3 of the younger hands. Go out and look at the cattle. While you're there, notice that the canyon would make a better position for the herd if we did get weather. Start moving them that way. By the time Roy figures out what you're doing, it'll already be half done, and he won't want to undo it." Walt looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since 4:30 this morning." He finished his coffee and set the cup down and stood up. "All right then. What else?" "Firewood. There's 4 cords stacked against the south barn wall. I need it moved inside before noon. All of it. The pipes to the east wing of the house are going to freeze if the temperature drops the way I think it's going to. We need to get water stored before that happens, every pot and barrel and bucket on the property. And someone needs to check the bunkhouse roof. There's a section of loose shingles on the northwest corner. In high wind." "I know the section," Walt said. "I've been after Roy to fix it for 2 months. It needs to happen today." He put his hat on. He nodded at her, not the way men nodded at hired help, but the way one person nods at another when they understand they're talking about something serious. "I'll see what I can do." She watched him walk out into the morning and then turned back to her dishes. The next 4 hours were the strangest of her 11 months at Blackstone Ranch. Walt was out there working, and she could see through the kitchen window that he had 2 of the younger hands with him, and they were all moving with purpose, even if they didn't fully understand why. She could see Pete Galloway out there still with that easy grin, but his hands were busy. She could see old Hector and young Miguel, and the quiet one named Sam, who barely spoke English but worked harder than anyone on the property. Inside, Clara moved through the kitchen like she was made for this. Because she was. 11 months of learning every cabinet, every shelf, every loose floorboard, and sticky drawer had not been wasted. She knew exactly where everything was. She knew exactly how much of everything they had. She began inventory counting flour and salt pork and dried beans and coffee with the precise, unhurried focus of a woman who had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Roy Hatch found her at 10 o'clock, standing on a chair to reach the back shelf of the pantry. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Inventory," she said without turning around. "I can see that. Why?" She climbed down off the chair and showed him the paper in her hand. "We have enough provisions for 8 days if we're careful. 10 if we stretch. I'd like to talk with you about water storage, Mr. Hatch. If the pipes in the East Wing freeze." "Clara." He said her name the way he said everything, like a period at the end of a sentence. "The pipes are not going to freeze. They will if the temperature drops below. The temperature is not going to drop that far. It's November. We get cold snaps in November, every year, without fail. And every year the ranch survives without—" He caught himself, gentled his tone. He was not a bad man, Roy Hatch. He was just a certain kind of man. "You do a fine job with the cooking. That's what I need you focused on." She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. "Yes, sir," she said, and went back to the pantry. When he left, she moved faster. By noon, she had filled every pot she owned with water and set them on the kitchen floor. She'd filled the 2 rain barrels outside the kitchen door and weighted the lids against wind. She'd pulled every extra blanket out of the storage chest in the back hallway and stacked them near the main fireplace. She'd unlocked the supply room that Roy kept bolted and borrowed the key from its hook when he stepped out for his midday check. She'd noted where it hung on her first week at the ranch, the way she noted everything, and she'd confirmed there were 3 extra lamps and sufficient oil. Walt came to the kitchen door at noon, his face red with cold. "Cattle are in the canyon," he said. "Or most of them, maybe 45 head. Roy came out and asked what we were doing, and I told him I'd noticed the pasture drainage looked questionable, and I wanted the herd on higher ground before we got any rain." "What did he say?" "He said I was getting paranoid in my old age." Walt almost smiled. "He let us keep moving them." "Good. What about the bunkhouse roof? Sam and Miguel are on it. Sam's better with a hammer than anyone on this property, and he knows it." Walt paused. "The temperature's dropped 3 more degrees since this morning." Clara looked at him. "I know." Roy still doesn't believe it. "I know that too." Walt took his hat off and turned it in his hands. He looked like he wanted to say something and wasn't sure how. "I've been working ranches for 40 years, he said finally. "I've seen a lot of people read weather. Not many of them read it the way you just did." He paused again. "Where'd you learn that?" "Wyoming," she said. "Idaho. 2 different places, 2 different storms." She went back to the stove. "Both times I saw it coming. Both times, nobody listened." Her voice was steady the way it always was. She'd learned steady a long time ago. "Both times I was right." Walt was quiet for a moment. "What happened? Those other times?" She kept her back to him. Her hands kept moving. "Wyoming, we lost 6 head and half the south roof. Idaho." She stopped, picked up a spoon, set it down. "Idaho was worse." He didn't ask anything else. That was one of the things she respected about Walt Decker. He knew when to stop asking. "Go eat something," she said, "and tell the men they should do the same. Hot food before dark." He put his hat back on and went. The afternoon moved fast and slow at the same time, the way afternoons do when you're watching the sky out of one eye and moving your hands with the other. The temperature kept dropping. The clouds that had been a dark suggestion on the northwest horizon at dawn were a full wall now rolling and bruised and mean. The wind had shifted twice since morning, and each time it shifted, Clara felt it in the back of her throat like the taste of iron. She made 2 enormous pots of beef stew and a full batch of cornbread, and enough coffee to keep 14 men awake through any storm that ever came out of a Montana sky. When the men came in for supper, the kitchen was warm and loud and full, and she moved among them filling bowls and refilling cups, and none of them were looking at the window. She was. "Wind's picking up," she said to no one in particular while refilling Pete Galloway's coffee. Pete glanced up at her. His grin had gone somewhere else over the course of the day. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. "You really think it's coming, don't you?" "It's already coming," Clara said. "The question now is just how bad." Something moved through Pete's face. Something that wasn't quite an apology, but was something in the same neighborhood. What should we be doing? She'd been waiting for that question all day. Not from Roy. Not from Walt. From one of the younger ones, the ones who still had that flexibility in them that would let them change their minds fast when they needed to. Firewood, she said. I need 2 men to bring the rest of it inside tonight. Not tomorrow morning, tonight. And I need someone to stay up and keep all 3 fireplaces going through the night. If the fires go out, I'll do it, Pete said, just like that. No more grin. The firewood and the fires. I'll stay up. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Mr. Galloway. He ducked his head the way young men do when they're embarrassed and trying not to show it. Roy Hatch ate his supper at the head of the table and said the stew was good and didn't say anything about the weather. He went to his room at 8 o'clock. Clara listened to his footsteps going up the stairs and across the floor above her, and then she heard the springs of his bed. And then she heard nothing. She stood alone in the kitchen. It was 9 o'clock at night. The first gust hit the house at 9:17. It hit hard enough to rattle every window in the east wall, hard enough to make the lamp flames flatten sideways, hard enough to pull a sound out of the chimney that wasn't like any sound a chimney ought to make. Clara had her hand on the stove rail before the sound finished bracing, without thinking about it, because her body remembered things even when her mind was busy elsewhere. Pete Galloway came through the kitchen door at a run, snow on his shoulders, and his hat blown half off his head. It's here, he said. He didn't sound disbelieving anymore. He sounded scared. Lord Almighty, it's here. You can't see 6 feet in front of your face out there. I know, Clara said. How much firewood did you get inside? All of it. Me and Sam got the last of it in an hour ago. He was breathing hard. What do I do? She pointed at the fireplace. Keep that going. Don't let it get below. She held her hand out, palm down at a height. This. You feel it dropping below that you add wood immediately. Don't wait. Don't ration. We have enough for 3 days, and this storm won't last 3 days. How do you know? Because none of them do. He went to the fireplace. She went to check the water pots on the floor, touching each one, the metal cold against her hands, reassured by the weight. The second gust hit at 9:45, and it was worse than the first. Walt appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10, his face blank in the way old men's faces go blank when they're seeing something they didn't expect to see. The temperature outside just hit 10 below, he said. Roy's awake. I figured. Roy Hatch came downstairs at 10:15 in his boots and coat, his hair not quite combed, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the windows running with snow and the walls breathing with wind, and his face did something complicated that Clara didn't quite have a word for. How bad? He said. He was looking at Walt. Walt looked at Clara. Roy followed his gaze. He looked at Clara Whitlock for what might have been the first time. Really looked at her, not at the food she was holding, or the direction she was walking, or the role she represented. At her. At her face. How bad? He said again. And this time he was asking her. Bad, she said, but we're going to be all right. She said it without hesitation, because hesitation in that moment would have cost something she couldn't afford to spend. The cattle are in the canyon. The firewood is inside. The water is stored. The bunkhouse roof is patched. The fires are going, and I've got a man keeping them that way. She met his eyes. We prepared, Mr. Hatch. You may not have known it, but we prepared. Roy Hatch stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at a woman he had spoken to 4 times in 11 months and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, What do you need from me? And Clara Whitlock, who had been waiting her entire life for someone to ask her that question, told him. She told him to wake the 3 men in the bunkhouse who weren't already awake and get them into the main house before the wind got any worse. She told him to bring the oil lamps out of the storage room, all of them, and distribute them to every room. She told him there was a window latch in the 2nd bedroom on the west side that had been loose for 2 months and needed someone sitting against that door before the wind found it. She told him what food to pull from the pantry and in what order if the storm ran longer than expected. She told him all of it in one uninterrupted breath, the way you tell someone things you've been carrying alone for a long time. Roy Hatch listened. He stood in the doorway, and he listened to every word. And then he did every single thing she said. The wind outside screamed. The snow came sideways, and it came thick, and it came mean. The way Montana blizzards do, as if the sky had been storing this particular fury for a long time, and had finally decided it was done waiting. The walls creaked. The chimney moaned. The lamps flickered every time a gust found a gap somewhere in the walls, and every time they flickered, Clara moved toward them before the light was fully back. Pete Galloway knelt by the main fireplace and fed it wood with the focus of a man who had decided he was responsible for something that mattered. He didn't look up when the walls shook. He didn't flinch when the window on the east side took a hit that sounded like a fist. He just kept feeding that fire steady and deliberate, the grin from this morning gone, somewhere it might not come back from. By midnight, all 14 men were inside. The cattle were in the canyon. The water was stored. The fires were burning. The roof was holding. Clara stood in her kitchen in the middle of the worst blizzard Blackstone Ranch had seen in 11 years, and she was making coffee. Because they were going to need it. Because the night was long, and the work wasn't done, and someone had to stay awake while the others rested, and that someone had always been her. That was the thing nobody understood about being the invisible person in the room. You could see everything from there, every weak point, every risk, every quietly approaching disaster. You could see it all, and you could spend your life screaming about it into the faces of people who looked through you, or you could simply start preparing. Clara had stopped screaming a long time ago. She poured the first cup and set it on the table for Walt, who was sitting in his usual chair at the far end, looking like he might be awake, or might be sleeping with Walt. It was always hard to tell. He wrapped his hands around the cup without opening his eyes. "You knew this morning?" he said. "You knew exactly how bad it was going to be. I had a pretty good idea, and you just started getting ready, without saying anything else, without—" He shook his head. Most people would have kept arguing, kept trying to make Roy listen. Roy wasn't going to listen, Clara said simply. So I stopped trying to make him, and started doing what needed doing. Walt opened his eyes then. He looked at her across the table, across the kitchen, across all 11 months of her being furniture that nobody bothered to really look at. "That takes a particular kind of strength," he said. "Knowing you're right, and being willing to work anyway, without anyone telling you that you're right." She filled her own cup and sat down across from him. Outside, the storm was at its full voice now, loud and indiscriminate and vast, the way natural things are when they decide to remind you how small you are. Inside, the fire was burning. The coffee was hot. 14 men were safe in their beds and their chairs and their spots on the floor, all of them trusting in something they didn't quite have words for. "I've been right before," Clara said. "Plenty of times." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Nobody listened those times either." "That's going to change," Walt said. She looked at him. "Is it after tonight?" He almost smiled again, that weathered almost smile he had. "I reckon it is." She didn't answer. She drank her coffee. Outside, the storm screamed and screamed, and inside Blackstone Ranch, because one woman had refused to wait for permission to do what needed doing, every living soul was exactly where they needed to be. That was the night Clara Whitlock stopped being the cook. None of them knew it yet. Not Roy, not Pete, not even Walt, who saw more than any of them. But Clara knew. She'd known it since 4:30 that morning, standing barefoot on the kitchen doorstep, looking at a sky that was about to change everything. She'd seen it in the clouds. She'd seen it in the horses. She'd felt it in the air, in the way the cold pressed down differently on a night before something serious. The way the world gets very still right before it decides to show you what it's made of. She'd been ready. She'd always been ready. The only thing that had changed tonight was that now they knew it too. The wind didn't let up until somewhere past 3 in the morning, and even then it didn't stop so much as pull back, the way a fist opens after it's already done its damage. Clara hadn't slept. She hadn't planned to. She'd moved through the night, the way she moved through everything, quietly, methodically, without asking anyone's permission or waiting for anyone's direction. When Pete Galloway's head started to drop at 1:30, She touched his shoulder, without waking him fully, and steered him toward the chair by the wall, and took over the fireplace herself. When old Hector started coughing from the cold that had seeped into the east hall, she made a pot of something her mother had called whiskey broth. Not enough whiskey to matter, but enough to warm from the inside out, and brought it to him without saying anything, and he drank it with both hands and looked at her with eyes that were too tired for words. When Sam appeared at the kitchen door at 2 in the morning, with snow crusted so thick on his coat it looked like he'd grown a second skin, she didn't ask what he'd been doing outside in that storm. She just handed him a towel and pointed at the chair nearest the fire. "Bunkhouse roof," he said in the halting English he reserved for moments when he had something important to say. "One corner." I held it. She looked at him. The cold had done something to his face, not hurt it exactly, but carved it down to what mattered. "You went back out there." It was coming loose again. He shrugged the way a man shrugs when he's done something dangerous and doesn't want to make a fuss about it. I held it. Clara handed him the whiskey broth and sat down across from him and didn't say anything for a while. There weren't words big enough for what he'd just done. Sometimes the right response to a brave thing was just to sit with it and let it be. Walt hadn't moved from his chair at the far end of the table. His eyes were closed, but she knew he wasn't sleeping. Walt Decker hadn't slept properly in years. She could tell by the way he held himself even in rest alert underneath the stillness, like a dog that's learned to look relaxed while still listening for the thing that would make running necessary. "Temperature's still dropping," he said without opening his eyes. "I know. Dropped 2 more degrees in the last hour." "I know. Roy came down again at midnight, checked the East Hall, didn't say anything." A pause. "He's been up there ever since." Clara looked at the ceiling. The floor above was quiet. "He's counting," she said. Walt opened one eye. "Counting what?" "Everything he might be losing." She refilled her coffee. "That's what ranchers do in a storm they didn't prepare for. They count. They run the numbers in their heads, how many head, what the beef prices are running, what the land's worth if something goes wrong. They count, and they wait, and they try to figure out how bad it's going to be." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He doesn't know yet that it's not going to be as bad as he thinks." "Because you prepared." "Because we prepared," she said. And she meant it. Walt and Sam and Pete, even reluctant Pete with his grin, that had finally found something better to do with itself, they'd made it possible. She'd had the knowledge. They'd done the work. Without them knowing wasn't worth a thing. Walt closed his eye again. "He's going to want to understand how," he said. "When morning comes and everything's still standing, he's going to want to understand how that happened." "That's his right," Clara said. "You going to tell him?" She considered the question the way she considered everything carefully, without rushing. "I'm going to tell him the truth," she said. "That's all I've ever had to give anybody." The fire popped and settled. Outside, the storm was quieter now, but not quiet, a constant low moan, like something enormous breathing. The house held. The walls held. The roof held. One by one, as the night deepened toward morning, the men sleeping in their makeshift spots around the main room stopped shifting and went still. And Clara moved among them as carefully as she moved, in a kitchen full of hot things, making sure nobody had let a blanket fall, making sure the lamps were turned down to save oil, making sure the firewood pile Pete had built up before he fell asleep was deep enough to last until dawn. She did all of this without waking anyone. She did all of this like she had been doing it her entire life, which she had. At 4 in the morning, Roy Hatch came downstairs again. He didn't look like a man who'd slept. He didn't look like a man who'd expected to. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the room, at the men sleeping at the fires, burning at the lamps, giving their steady, low light, at Clara standing in the kitchen doorway with a coffee pot in her hand, and his face did that complicated thing again, the one she still didn't have a word for. "Sit down, Mr. Hatch," she said. "I'll get you a cup." He sat. He wrapped his hands around the cup she put in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. "How'd you know?" he said. She'd been expecting that question since the first gust hit at 9:17. "I've lived through storms like this before," she said. "You learn to read the signs if you pay attention long enough. Most people don't read them the way you did. Most people aren't looking." Roy turned the cup in his hands. He was a big man, wide through the chest, the kind of man who'd built something out of nothing and knew the weight of what he'd built. Watching him sit at her kitchen table looking humbled was a strange thing, not satisfying the way some people might have expected it to feel. Just strange, like seeing a mountain sit down. "The cattle," he said, "in the canyon. Walt moved them yesterday morning." Roy looked up. "Walt said it was a drainage concern. That's not what it was." A pause. "No, I imagine not." He looked back down at his cup. "And the firewood." "Inside since yesterday afternoon." "The water." "Those pots on the floor behind you." He turned and looked at the row of covered pots lined up against the kitchen wall. He turned back. Something moved through his face, not quite shame, because Roy Hatch was not a man built for shame, but something in the same family. Recognition, maybe. The specific discomfort of a capable man realizing he'd been less capable than he thought. "I told you to focus on the cooking," he said. "You did." "You didn't listen." "No, sir." He was quiet for a long time. The fire shifted. Walt didn't move from his chair at the far end of the table, but Clara knew he was hearing every word. Roy probably knew it too. Some conversations needed a witness. "How long have you worked here?" Roy asked. 11 months, Clara said. 11 months. He said it like he was calculating something. "And in 11 months, I never—" He stopped. Started again. "I didn't—" He stopped again. He wasn't a man who fumbled for words often. She could see the unfamiliarity of it on him, the discomfort of reaching for something that wasn't where he expected it. "I didn't know your name for the first 3 weeks, he said finally. "Did I?" "No, sir." "That's—" He shook his head. "That's not right." "No," she agreed. It wasn't. Roy Hatch looked at Clara Whitlock across his own kitchen table, in the middle of the longest night Blackstone Ranch had seen in years, and did not look away. "I'm sorry for that," he said. She received the apology, the way she received everything without making a show of it. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, drank his coffee. "What else do you need tonight?" And just like that, they were back to work. That was the thing about capable people. They could feel something real and then set it aside and get back to what needed doing. Clara respected that more than she could say. "We need someone to check the barn at first light," she said. "The horses were restless yesterday. I want to make sure they weathered the worst of it without injury. And we need to see about the cattle as soon as the wind drops enough to move safely. Some of them will need checking. Frostbite happens faster in this kind of cold than most people think." "I'll go to the barn myself at dawn," Roy said. "I'll have breakfast ready when you come back. Hot food, not quick food. The men are going to need it." Roy stood up. He looked at her one more time, that direct, finally awake look that felt like a door opening somewhere. "Get some sleep, Clara," he said. "Couple hours at least." "When the fires are settled," she said. He nodded and went back upstairs. She listened to his footsteps crossing the ceiling. They sounded different than they had before. Slower. Like a man who was walking more carefully because he'd just been reminded the floor could move. Walt opened both eyes. "Told you," he said. "Hush," said Clara, and went to check the fires. She let herself sleep for 2 hours, curled on the bench seat along the kitchen wall, with her shawl pulled up and one ear still listening. It was not good sleep. It was the shallow, functional kind that takes the worst edge off without doing much else, but it was enough. It had to be. She was back at the stove by 6:30, and by the time Roy came in from the barn at 7, stamping snow from his boots, she had eggs and salt pork and biscuits and a pot of oatmeal, big enough to feed an army, which was what she had. The men woke slowly, in the disoriented way. Men wake when they've slept somewhere that wasn't their bed. And they came to the table still rumpled and half-stunned from the night. And they ate without speaking much the way people eat after something serious has happened, with a particular attention to the food, like they're grateful for the specific fact of it. Pete Galloway was the first one to say anything. He looked out the window. The storm had dropped to something manageable, just snow and cold without the murderous wind. And then he looked at Clara, who was refilling coffee down the far end of the table. "Miss Clara," he said. She looked up. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. There were things Pete Galloway wanted to say that he didn't have words for yet. She could see him working on it the way you can see a young man working on something that's requiring him to be bigger than he's used to being. "The biscuits are real good," he said finally. It was not what he'd meant to say. They both knew it. But she accepted it with a nod and moved on, because sometimes that was how things got said sideways, through smaller words, until the real ones found their way. Hector drank 2 cups of coffee and ate twice what he usually ate, and said in Spanish something she understood enough of to know was a prayer of thanksgiving. Sam sat across from him and ate in his quiet way, and when he caught her eye, he gave one small nod, and she gave one back. Walt ate his oatmeal without ceremony and watched everyone the way Walt always watched, taking in information, storing it, deciding what it meant. Roy sat at the head of the table and ate his eggs and didn't say much, but he was present in a way he hadn't been before. Not just physically. Roy Hatch had always been physically present, large and certain, and taking up his full share of space. But present as in paying attention, as in seeing the room instead of just inhabiting it. It was Miguel who said it first out loud, the thing that everyone at that table was feeling. Miguel was 24-second youngest after Pete, and he had a wife in town, and a baby who'd been born in the spring, and he felt things more openly than the other men did, wore his heart closer to the surface. He'd grown up being teased for it, and he'd never quite managed to stop. He set down his fork in the middle of breakfast and said to no one in particular, "We would have lost the cattle." Nobody argued with him. "If we'd left them in the east pasture." He shook his head slowly. "We would have lost most of them." Roy set down his own fork. "I know," he said. "And the bunkhouse roof." Sam went back out there in the middle of that storm. Miguel looked at Sam, who looked at his oatmeal. "If the corner had gone, we'd have lost the whole roof in that wind. All our gear. Everything in there." The table was very quiet. "I know," Roy said again. Miguel picked up his fork, put it down again. "I laughed," he said. "Yesterday morning, when Miss Clara told Mr. Hatch about the storm." He didn't look at Clara when he said it. He looked at the table. "I didn't say it out loud, but I laughed. Inside I laughed." He shook his head, once decisive and self-condemning. "I'm not going to do that again." Clara poured his coffee without saying anything. She squeezed his shoulder, once brief light, the way you acknowledge something true, without making it into a bigger thing than it needs to be. Pete was looking at his own hands. "Me neither," he said quietly. The morning moved on. Roy organized teams to check the cattle in the canyon, assess any damage to the outbuildings, dig out what needed digging out, and begin the slow work of putting the ranch back in order after the storm. He did it with his usual efficiency, assigning men to tasks in the crisp way he'd always done, and the men moved out to do their work. What was different was that before he walked out the door himself, Roy Hatch stopped and turned back to the kitchen. "Clara," he said. She was at the sink. She turned. "When things are settled here, maybe this afternoon, maybe tonight, I'd like to sit down with you." He said it straight, the way a man talks to someone he's decided to take seriously. "I'd like to understand what else you've seen. About the ranch. About what we might be missing." She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the snow was still coming down, but soft now, without menace. The light was that particular white that comes after a storm, when the world is rearranged but intact. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded and walked out, and she turned back to her sink, and her hands were very steady. Walt hadn't left yet. He was still at the table, his second cup of coffee half drunk in front of him, and he was watching her with those crow's feet eyes that had seen 40 years of things that mattered, and had learned to know which was which. "Told you?" he said again. "Still hush," said Clara. But she was almost smiling. The damage reports came in through the morning piece by piece, carried by men coming back from their checks with snow on their hats and stories building in their eyes. Tom Fairfield from the neighboring Anchor Cross Ranch appeared at the kitchen door at 10:30, having ridden through the aftermath in the kind of desperate hurry that only comes when a man has left behind something bad enough that cold doesn't slow him down. Clara saw his face before he said a word. "Come in," she said. "Sit down." He was 40. Tom Fairfield, a lean man with a mustache. He was inexplicably proud of, and a tendency to underestimate problems, right up until they were standing on his chest. He came inside and sat down and accepted the coffee she put in front of him and didn't drink it. "We lost the south barn," he said. She sat down across from him. "Roof came in." He stared at the table. "We had 60 head sheltered in there. Got about 30 out before the roof went." His jaw worked. 30 head gone. Maybe more, some of them ran and we haven't found them. He looked up at her. "How are you here, Roy's place?" "Cattle are fine," Clara said. "We moved them to the canyon yesterday afternoon." Something moved through Tom Fairfield's face. Something complicated, like a man doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. "The canyon," he repeated. "Hell. We had about half an hour between when things started looking serious and when the storm hit. Not enough time to move anyone." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Roy must have started early." Clara said nothing. Tom looked around the kitchen, at the water pots against the wall, at the extra firewood stacked by the fireplace, at the careful order of things that didn't happen without intention. He was a rancher. He knew what readiness looked like. He knew the difference between a place that had been lucky and a place that had been prepared. He looked at Clara. She met his eyes. "Roy started early," he said again slowly, like a man who was saying something he didn't quite mean, but couldn't find the words for what he did mean. "We started early," Clara said. "All of us." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He had the look of a man carrying a weight that was too heavy to put down and too heavy to keep carrying, and Clara knew that look well enough to know there wasn't much anyone could do about it, except let him sit with it and make sure he didn't sit with it alone. "Stay for breakfast," she said. "There's biscuits left." He stayed. More news came through the morning, carried by riders, and on the wind, and in the terse exchanges of men who weren't built for talking about hard things, but had hard things to talk about. The Henderson outfit 2 miles north had lost their entire wood supply. When the woodshed collapsed, they were burning furniture to stay warm. The Larkin brothers' place had flooding from snowmelt, getting into the root cellar, 3 months of preserved food ruined. Old Ben Garvey, who ranched alone 6 miles east, had a section of roof that had simply ceased to exist sometime around midnight, and he'd spent the worst of the storm in his barn with his horses, because it was the only structure on his property still standing. Each piece of news arrived in Clara's kitchen and settled around her table like unwanted guests. She fed whoever brought it, sent what supplies she could spare, and kept track of it all in the careful inventory she maintained in her head. By noon, when Roy came back from his rounds with Walt beside him and both their faces serious but not devastated, she had a clear picture of what the valley looked like. She laid it out for Roy at the kitchen table. No paper, no writing, just what she'd heard and what it meant. And he listened with the specific attention of a man who'd learned somewhere between 4 in the morning and noon that listening was worth his time. "The Hendersons need firewood," she said. "We have surplus in the east storage. It's not charity, they've helped us in the past, and they'll help us again. Send 2 men over this afternoon with what we can spare." She paused. "Old Ben Garvey needs more than firewood. He needs people. He shouldn't be out there alone tonight." Roy looked at her. "You think we should bring him here? I think someone should ride out and ask him. He's a proud man. He won't come if you send someone to fetch him. He'll come if you send someone to invite him." She looked at Roy directly. "You should go yourself." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right." He said it without hesitation, the way a man says something when he's gotten past the part where admitting you're right requires him to be wrong. That was new. That was different from this morning, and different from last night, and different from 11 months of her being furniture in his kitchen. Something had shifted in Roy Hatch in the hours between the first gust at 9:17 and noon the following day, and she could see it operating in real time, could see him reorganizing his understanding of things around a new center of gravity. She found it remarkable. Not surprising exactly. She'd seen it happen before, the moment when a person who'd been looking past you finally looked at you instead, and everything rearranged itself. She'd seen it happen. She just hadn't expected to see it happen this fast, or this completely. "I'll go to Garvey's after I check on the horses," Roy said. He started to push back from the table, then stopped. He looked at her with that new directness. "Clara, when you said this morning that you wanted me to understand what else you'd seen, about the ranch," he paused. "How long have you been paying attention to things like this?" "Since I got here," she said. 11 months. "Yes, sir. And before that, other ranches. Every place I've worked. It's—" She considered how to say it. "It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't done it. When you're in a position where nobody asks your opinion, you start putting your opinions somewhere else. You write them down, or you keep them in your head, or you just observe. You keep watching because watching is the only thing available to you." Roy looked at her steadily. "What have you seen here at this ranch? What have you been watching?" She met his gaze. "You have a fence line on the northeast quarter that's going to fail in the spring floods. It's not the age of the fence, it's the grade of the land. The water will find the low point, which is exactly where you've got your south post, and it'll take 20 feet of fence with it and whatever cattle are in that pasture." She said it simply, without drama. "You've got a grazing rotation problem in the west pasture. You've been running the same herd in the same section for 3 seasons, and the grass is losing its root structure. Another 2 seasons, and that section won't recover easily." She paused. "And there's a water source you don't know about." Roy went very still. "What do you mean?" "East of the canyon where the cattle were last night, about 400 yards east, there's a low point in the terrain that doesn't drain the way it should. The grass around it is a different color in late summer, denser, darker green. In my second month here, I walked out there and dug down about 18 inches with a stick." She held Roy Hatch's gaze. "Water. Good water. I think it's a spring that's never been properly found." The kitchen was very quiet. Walt made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Roy stared at her. "You found an underground spring on my property." "I think so. I can't be certain without proper equipment and someone who knows more than I do about subsurface water. But yes, that's what I believe I found." Roy Hatch sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the table. He looked at Clara. "A year," he said. "You've been sitting on this for almost a year." "You never asked," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb. It watched the weight of it settle into him, watched him understand what it cost to have someone like Clara in your kitchen for 11 months without ever once sitting down and saying, "What do you know? What do you see? What have you been noticing that I might have missed?" "I'm asking now," he said. "I know," she said, "and I'm going to tell you everything." Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was the particular hard blue that comes after a Montana storm, clear and cold and enormous. The kind of sky that makes everything on the ground look small and precise and exactly itself. Inside the kitchen of Blackstone Ranch, Clara Whitlock set her coffee cup down and began to talk. She talked for a long time. Roy Hatch listened for every word of it, and Walt Decker sat at the far end of the table with his eyes half closed and his hands wrapped around his cup, and he listened too, and once, just once, when Clara said something that landed particularly true, he let himself smile, the full version of that smile, instead of the almost version. It was the first time Clara had seen that. She filed it away with everything else she noticed, carefully, precisely in the place where she kept all the things that mattered. Because everything mattered. It always had. The only difference was that now finally someone else in this room understood that too. And the work of turning knowing into doing the real work, the work that would take months and seasons, and the particular kind of patience she'd spent her whole life developing, was just beginning. Roy came back from Ben Garvey's place at 3:30 with the old man riding beside him on a borrowed horse, and Clara knew the moment she heard two sets of boots on the porch steps, instead of one that Roy had done it right. Ben Garvey was 71 years old and had been ranching alone since his wife passed 8 years back, and he had the particular pride of a man who'd never asked for help in his life and wasn't entirely sure he knew how. He came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and his jaw set at an angle that was trying very hard to be dignity and landing somewhere closer to barely holding together. Clara put a bowl of stew in front of him before he sat down. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I don't need charity," he said. "It's not charity," she said. "It's supper. Sit down, Mr. Garvey." He sat down. He ate the stew. He didn't say another word for 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes, something in the set of his jaw loosened degree by degree, until by the time he pushed the empty bowl away, he looked less like a man defending a position and more like a man who had been cold and hungry and was finally neither. "Roof's gone," he said to Roy, who had sat down across from him with his own supper. "I know," Roy said. "Can't stay in the house till it's fixed." "I know that too." "I ain't." Ben Garvey stopped, started again. "I appreciate the invitation, is what I'm saying." Roy nodded. "You'd do the same." Ben looked at Clara again, at her hands at the kitchen, at the careful order of everything in it. He was a man who noticed practical things, always had been. He could see what had happened here, or the shape of it at least. "Your place looks about like nothing happened," he said. "How's that?" Roy opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he looked at Clara. It was a small gesture, barely a glance, but Walt caught it from the far end of the table, and Pete caught it from where he was standing by the door, and in its smallness, it said more than a formal introduction would have. "Ask her," Roy said. Ben Garvey looked at Clara with fresh eyes. Not the dismissive half-glance she'd been getting for 11 months. The real kind. The kind that actually sees. She told him the short version, the sky, the horses. The temperature dropped the list she'd had memorized since 4:30 the previous morning. Ben Garvey listened without interrupting, which was the highest courtesy an old rancher could pay. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My wife used to read weather like that," he said. His voice had gone somewhere quieter. "I never learned how. Thought I didn't need to." He looked at the table. "Thought wrong, I reckon." Clara refilled his coffee and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would make it better. And she'd learned a long time ago that making things better wasn't always what a moment called for. Sometimes a moment just called for witness. The ranch settled into a different kind of quiet that evening. The particular quiet that comes after a crisis, when the adrenaline has burned off, and what's left is something rawer. The bone-level gratitude of people who came closer to losing something than they'd understood until the moment of safety was real. The men gathered in the main room after supper, not because Roy had called them, but because nobody wanted to be alone quite yet, and they talked in the low, honest way that men talk when they've been through something together and don't quite have the language for it. Clara moved through the kitchen cleaning up, and she could hear their voices through the open doorway. Not the words exactly, but the texture of them. The way Pete's voice had lost that light, deflecting quality it carried most of the time. The way Sam's limited English wasn't limiting him any less than usual, but somehow mattered less. The way Roy's voice, when she caught it, sounded like a man who was listening as much as he was talking. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You should come sit with us," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "Roy said so, and—" He paused, ran a hand over the back of his neck. "And I'm saying so too." Clara dried her hands. She came to the doorway of the main room and leaned against the frame and didn't go further in because some habits are deep, and 11 months of being furniture in a room doesn't evaporate in a single night, no matter what the night accomplished. But she stayed there. She listened. She was present in a way she hadn't been permitted to be before, not invited, not visible, not counted. Walt caught her eye from across the room and tipped his head a fraction of an inch. She understood it the same way she understood everything Walt communicated precisely and without ceremony. "You belong here," that fraction said. It always was yours. She didn't let herself feel it too much. Not yet. In her experience, the moments right after a crisis were not the moments that told the truth about a thing. People were different when they were scared. People were generous in the aftermath of danger. The test wasn't how a man treated you the day after he almost lost everything he had. The test was who he was 6 weeks later when the memory had softened and the biscuits were just biscuits again, and everything had gone back to ordinary. She'd learned that the hard way more than once. So she stayed in the doorway. She listened. She was present. And she was careful, the way she was always careful about how much weight she put on the thing that was happening. She didn't sleep well that second night. Not from worry the worst was past, she was certain of that, but from something she couldn't quite name. A keyed-up quality to her thoughts, the way a body stays alert after danger, even when the danger is objectively gone. She lay on the kitchen bench in the small hours and stared at the ceiling and thought about underwater springs and fence lines and grass that was losing its root structure, and somewhere in there she thought about James. Her husband dead 10 years now, and what he would have made of today. James Whitlock had believed in her absolutely. That was one of the truest things she knew about him. He'd listened to her the way Roy Hatch had started to listen completely without reservation. And the difference between that and the 11 months she'd spent at Blackstone being invisible was the kind of difference that didn't have a number big enough to describe it. She'd spent 10 years since James died, moving from kitchen to kitchen, carrying what she knew in silence, because silence was what was available to her, and she'd told herself it was enough. She'd told herself that knowing was its own reward, that being useful even when no one recognized it was still being useful, that the thing she was had value, whether anyone saw it or not. She'd believed that. She still believed it. But tonight, in the honest dark of the kitchen, with the storm past and the fires low and 14 men breathing in the rooms around her, she let herself admit that being seen, being actually seen for the first time in years, felt like something she hadn't known she was starving for until someone put it in front of her. She made herself stop thinking about it. She closed her eyes. She slept. Morning came cold and clear and loud with the work that a storm always left behind it. Roy had every man on the property assigned to something useful. Before breakfast was finished, digging out the east pathway, checking the hay supplies, riding the full perimeter of the property to assess what the wind had done to fencing and outbuildings. The ranch moved with a purposefulness that felt different from before, and Clara thought she understood why. People work differently when they remember what the stakes are. They move with the specific intention of people who have recently been reminded that a thing can be lost. She was pulling biscuits from the oven at 8:30 when she heard riders coming up the main approach, not one or two, the way visitors usually came, but several. She counted the hoofbeats without thinking about it, the way you count things when you've trained yourself to notice. 4 horses. She wiped her hands and went to the kitchen window and looked out, because 4 horses on a morning like this, coming from the direction of town, was either news or trouble. And in her experience, those two things were frequently the same. She recognized the man in front, from the town, Franklin Colby, who ran the feed and grain operation in Harlan Creek, and was in the particular way of men who controlled necessary things accustomed to being deferred to. He was in his mid-50s, heavy through the middle, with a face that had been handsome once, and now mostly expressed the satisfaction of a man who expected to get what he wanted and usually did. Behind him rode 3 men she didn't know. Roy came out of the barn and met them in the yard, and Clara watched through the window as they talked. She couldn't hear the words. She could hear the tone Roy's voice, steady Colby's voice, carrying the particular cadence of a man who has come to deliver something and wants credit for the delivery. 10 minutes later, Roy came inside. His face was doing something careful. "That was Franklin Colby," he said. "I saw." Roy looked at her. "He's heard about the storm, about the damage across the valley." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "He's offering to buy out the Garvey property. Immediate cash sale, fair market value." He paused. "Or what he's calling fair market value." Clara set the biscuit pan down. "What's the actual market value?" "Probably 40% more than what he's offering." Roy's voice was flat. Ben's roof is gone. Ben knows that fixing a roof in Montana in November is not a small thing. And Ben is 71 years old and alone, and Colby knows that too. So he came the morning after the storm. He came the morning after the storm, Roy confirmed. Clara looked out the window. Colby was still in the yard with his men waiting with the patient confidence of a man who expected to get what he came for. How many other properties is he approaching? Roy looked at her sharply. What makes you think, because a man like that doesn't ride out for one property, not in this weather, not the morning after a storm. He rode out because the storm gave him an opportunity, and he's not the kind of man to let an opportunity sit. She picked up the biscuit pan again. Henderson lost the South Barn. Larkin Brothers lost the root cellar stores. Who else? Roy was quiet for a moment. Perkins' place took significant roof damage. 2 families on the north side of the valley had buildings go down entirely. He looked at the window. 3 of those families are carrying debt they were already struggling with before last night. And now they're vulnerable, Clara said. And now they're vulnerable, Roy said. They looked at each other. He'll make them offers, Clara said. The same kind he's making Ben. Call it fair, make it fast, apply the pressure of the moment before they have time to think clearly or ask anyone else's opinion. She kept her voice even. In 6 months, he could own half the productive land in this valley. Roy's jaw tightened. You know a lot about how men like Colby work. I've seen men like Colby before, she said. At every ranch I've ever worked. Different names, same arithmetic. She looked at him directly. The question is, what you're going to do about it? Roy was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the window. He looked at Clara. I can talk to Ben, he said slowly. Tell him not to sign anything yet. Yes, I can ride out to the Henderson place, the Larkin brothers. He was thinking out loud now, working through it the way she'd seen him work through problems systematically, practically building from what he knew. I can make sure they understand they have time, that the damage is real, but the decisions don't have to happen today. Yes, she said again. And? He looked up. Colby doesn't just go away because you tell people to wait, she said. He'll come back. He'll keep coming back, and he'll keep making the pressure feel like an act of generosity, and eventually some of these families are going to be tired and cold and scared enough that his offer starts to sound like a solution. She paused. The only thing that actually stops a man like that is community. Roy waited. If these ranches act alone, they're vulnerable one by one, Clara said. If they act together, share labor for repairs pool, what they have in terms of supplies and skills. Support each other through the winter with actual practical help. Colby's leverage disappears. You can't pressure someone into selling when they're not desperate, and they won't be desperate if they're not alone. Roy Hatch sat at his kitchen table and looked at the woman he had spoken to 4 times in 11 months, who had spent those 11 months memorizing the weaknesses of his property and the character of his neighbors, and the nature of the men who would try to exploit both. He looked at her for a long time. How do you see all of this? He said. Because nobody's ever watching me, she said. So I watch everything else. Roy stood up. He put on his hat. I'm going back out to talk to Colby, he said. Then I'm going to ride to every damaged property in this valley before nightfall. He stopped at the door. Would you come with me? Clara looked at him. To the properties. You understand these families better than I do, he said simply. And you understand Colby better than I do. And He stopped. I'd like to have someone beside me who sees things clearly. It was the longest thing Roy Hatch had said to her in 11 months. It was also, she thought, the truest. Let me get my coat, she said. What happened next was the strangest afternoon of Clara Whitlock's life since the afternoon she'd buried her husband in Wyoming 10 years ago, and understood in her body for the first time what alone actually meant. Roy handled Colby efficiently, thanked him for his concern, declined the offer on Ben Garvey's behalf with the authority of a man who understood he had no legal right to do so, but whose certainty made the legal question feel beside the point. Colby pushed back exactly once pleasantly, the way a confident man applies a small amount of pressure to test the resistance, and Roy didn't move an inch, and Colby tipped his hat and rode back toward town with the 4 horses and the 3 men and the satisfied look of a man who has lost a skirmish but has not given up on the war. Clara watched him go and felt the specific chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He would be back. She knew it with the same certainty she'd known about the storm. But that was a problem for later. Today's problem was the valley. They rode together to 7 properties before the light started failing Roy on his bay gelding. Clara, on the small roan mare she'd been quietly befriending for 6 months, the one nobody else at the ranch could get close to, because nobody else had thought to bring her apple cores on a regular basis. Roy noticed the mare's behavior and glanced at Clara sideways, but didn't say anything, which she appreciated. At each property, the same story in different versions. Damage that was real and serious. Fear that was real and serious. And underneath both of those things, the exhausted, exposed feeling of people who had survived something bad and were now trying to figure out if they were strong enough to survive what came after. At the Henderson place, Roy talked to Eli Henderson about the South Barn, while Clara sat with Eli's wife Ruth in the kitchen and drank coffee and talked about her children and her canning supplies and what she'd managed to pull out of the collapsed storage before the roof came down. It was not a practical conversation in the way that Roy's conversation was practical. But when they left, Ruth Henderson had agreed to send her eldest son over to Blackstone Ranch with a message the following morning, and Clara had a clear picture of exactly what the Henderson family could contribute to a collective effort and what they would need in return. At the Larkin brothers' place, Clara spoke with the younger brother Thomas, who was 28 and had the look of a man who had been frightened very badly and was working hard to look like he hadn't been. She didn't try to make him feel better. She just told him what had happened at Blackstone Ranch plainly without drama and watched his face while the information landed. "You're the cook," he said about halfway through. "I am," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. "Huh," he said. It was not a dismissive sound. It was the sound of a man rearranging something in his mind. "How are your food stores?" she asked. He told her. She listened. She filed it away in the inventory she was building, not just of Blackstone Ranch now, but of the entire valley, the way a general takes stock of a territory before deciding how to defend it. By the time they turned back toward home in the failing light with the cold coming down hard again and their breath making clouds in the air, Clara had a picture in her mind of the valley that she was fairly certain no one else had. Not Roy, not Colby, not the county seat 30 miles away, where decisions were made by men who had never spent a winter in Montana without a warm house already waiting for them. Roy was quiet for most of the ride home. She let him be quiet. He was processing, she could tell, the same way he'd processed everything today, systematically building from what he knew toward what he needed to do. She'd watched him do it 6 times in 7 properties, and she'd found it genuinely impressive. Roy Hatch was not a man who wasted time on feelings in moments that called for thinking. That was a quality she respected. "You talked to Ruth Henderson for 45 minutes, he said finally, when they were about a mile from the ranch. "What did you talk about?" "Children. Canning. What she managed to save." "For 45 minutes. "Yes." "And what did you learn?" Clara considered. "That the Henderson family will be all right long-term if they have help through the winter. That Ruth is the one who makes the decisions, and Eli is the one who thinks he does. That their eldest son, the one they're sending over tomorrow, is 17, and has his father's build and his mother's judgment, which means he'll be genuinely useful to us." She paused. "And that Franklin Colby came to their property 2 hours before we did." Roy pulled his horse up. "What?" "He made the same offer he made Ben. Ruth told him they needed time to think. He told her he could only hold the offer open for 48 hours. Clara kept her horse moving. "He's working the valley systematically, starting with the most damaged properties and working outward. He knew about the damage before he rode out this morning." Roy caught up with her. "He couldn't have known that fast. He knew because someone told him. Before the storm." She looked at Roy. Colby didn't come out this morning because he heard about the damage. He came out this morning because he'd been waiting for a storm big enough to cause damage, and he had someone watching for it. She watched Roy's face. This isn't opportunism. This is planning. Roy was quiet for 30 seconds. 30 seconds was a long time for Roy Hatch to be quiet when there was something to think about. You're saying he's been waiting for a winter like this? I'm saying the pieces fit together in a way that doesn't make sense as coincidence. She kept her voice level. He had men with him this morning. 3 of them riding out in the cold right after a blizzard. That's not what you do when you hear bad news and decide to help. That's what you do when you've been expecting bad news and you've got your response already planned. Roy's jaw worked. If that's true, then the damaged properties in this valley aren't an accident. They're a circumstance someone has been patient enough to wait for. She looked at him. That changes what needs to happen next. How? Because it means we're not just helping neighbors recover from a storm, she said. We're protecting land from a man who's been thinking about owning it for longer than any of these families have been thinking about selling it. She watched the ranch come into view, the lights from the windows, the smoke from the chimneys, the particular solidity of a place that had prepared for what came against it. And the way you protect land from a patient man is to be more organized than he is. Roy looked at the ranch. He looked at Clara. He looked at the ranch again. All right, he said. Tell me what you think we need to do. She told him. She told him all of it. The cooperative structure she was thinking about, where 4 or 5 ranches shared labor and knowledge through the winter. The way to approach the county records to verify what Colby actually owned and what he was trying to acquire. The argument to make to the families who would be hardest to convince. The ones who would need to see action before they believed in words. The specific order in which to approach each property to build momentum rather than resistance. She talked for the full last mile home, steady and precise, and without drama. And Roy listened with the attention of a man who has given up pretending he has better information than the person talking. They rode into the yard and handed their horses to Pete, who was waiting. Despite the cold, and went inside, and Clara hung up her coat and went directly to the stove to start supper, because 14 people needed to eat, and the conversation could continue over food as well as it could continue anywhere. Roy stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her move from stove to counter to pantry and back. There was something in his face that hadn't been there yesterday. Something that looked like the specific kind of respect that can only be earned through demonstration, not told, not assumed, not granted by position. Earned. Clara, he said. She turned. I owe you an apology that's bigger than the one I gave you this morning, he said. I'm not going to make it right now because I don't think I've got the words for it yet. He paused. But I'm going to find them. She looked at him for a moment. You've got time, she said. She turned back to the stove. Walt came in from the main room and settled into his usual chair, and she poured his coffee without being asked, same as always. He looked at her over the rim of his cup, that long reading look, and she braced slightly, the way she always did when Walt was about to say something that was going to cost her some composure to hear. How bad is Colby? He said. She moved the pot back to the stove. Bad enough. He's got property up north, the timber section, Walt said. Been acquiring bits and pieces of the valley for years. Nobody connected the pieces because it happened slowly. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Started noticing about 3 years ago. Didn't know what to make of it. Clara looked at him sharply. You knew he was acquiring land. Knew he was buying. Didn't know the pattern had a shape to it until just now, listening to you and Roy in the yard. He met her eyes. I hear better than most people think. She stared at him. Walt, what exactly do you know about what Franklin Colby owns? He told her. It took 20 minutes and 2 cups of coffee, and by the end of it, Clara was sitting down, which she almost never did. During supper preparation, there was always too much to do with her elbows on the table, and her mind working at a speed she could feel in her chest. Walt had years of quiet observation on her. He'd watched Colby's patterns since long before she arrived at Blackstone. He'd seen parcels change hands that nobody talked about publicly. He'd heard conversations in the town feed store and the barber shop, the places old men go when they have nothing specific to do and absorb everything by existing in a space long enough. He'd assembled a picture that was incomplete, but that laid alongside what Clara had gathered today became something else entirely. "He's not trying to buy damaged properties," she said. "He already owns the properties around them." Walt looked at her steadily. "The damaged ranches aren't the target," she said. She was working through it as she spoke the way she did her best, thinking out loud, building each sentence from the one before it, not stopping until the shape was clear. "They're the path. If Colby owns the land on the north, the east, and the south sides of a property, and then that property becomes too expensive to maintain." She stopped. "It doesn't matter how the damage happened," Walt said. "Storm damage dead a bad season. If they can't sustain the operation, they have to sell. And the only buyer who makes sense geographically is the man who already holds the land around them." "He's building a corridor," Clara said, "through the valley." Walt nodded. "Just once. Very slow." "The water source?" Clara said. Her voice had changed, tightened. "The underground spring I found on Roy's property. If that spring is what I think it is, a source that feeds east as well as west, then this property is not incidental to what Colby's doing." She looked at Walt. "This property is central to it." Walt set his coffee cup down. "He needs Blackstone Ranch," Clara said. "That's why he came here this morning, even though our damage was minimal. Not for Ben Garvey's land, for Roy's." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Then Roy's voice came from the doorway, quiet and cold as the Montana air outside. "Say that again." She turned. He was standing in the doorway to the main room with his arms crossed, and his face the particular careful blank of a man who has heard something that might change everything and is taking the necessary half-second to make sure he understood it correctly. She said it again, all of it. The corridor, the water, the way the pieces fit together with Walt's information added to hers. She said it clearly, and without softening any of it, because Roy Hatch was not a man who needed things softened, and because the situation was past the point where softening served anything. When she finished, Roy was quiet for a long time. Pete had appeared in the doorway behind him at some point during the telling. She'd registered his presence without stopping. And Ben Garvey was there too, the old man leaning against the wall with his arms folded, and his face doing something she hadn't seen on it before. Something sharp and energized, like a man who has been given back something he thought was gone. "He came for the property," Roy said. Not a question. "Yes." "Using the storm as cover." "Yes." "And without this valley holding together, without the other properties staying intact, he eventually gets what he wants anyway, just without the storm having to do the work." "That's what I believe," Clara said. "Yes." Roy looked at her. He looked at Walt. He looked at Ben Garvey, who straightened up from the wall and said in a voice 30 years younger than his face, "I'll be damned if Franklin Colby gets 1 inch of my land." Pete said, "What do we do?" And they all looked at Clara. Not at Roy. Not at Walt. Not at the biggest man in the room, or the oldest, or the one who owned the most land, or had the most money, or held the most obvious authority. At Clara. She stood at her own stove in her kitchen, in the middle of the hardest month this valley had seen in years. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt the full weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not invisible. Not overlooked. Not furniture in someone else's room. Here. Present. Counted. She picked up the coffee pot. She looked at the people in her doorway, Roy, Pete, Ben, and Walt still at the table, and she could hear the other men stirring in the main room, drawn by the particular quality of a serious conversation, the way people are always drawn to the sound of something that matters. "We're going to need more coffee," she said, "and then we're going to need every man in this house at this table, because what we're about to plan is going to take all of us." She poured. They came. And at that kitchen table in Blackstone Ranch, with the Montana winter pressing cold and indifferent against every wall, Something began that was bigger than any of them had planned on, something that had started with one woman watching a sky at 4:30 in the morning and had grown through a night and a day, and a reckoning into a thing that had a fighting chance. Outside, Franklin Colby was riding back to town with his plans still intact and his patience still certain. He had no idea what was sitting at that kitchen table. He had no idea who had put it there. The planning went on until midnight. Clara kept the coffee coming and let the conversation find its own shape, which was what good conversations needed. Not someone directing them from the front, but someone making sure the conditions were right for the best thinking to happen. She'd learned that from years of watching men in kitchens talk around problems they needed to solve, and she knew the difference between a conversation that was building toward something and one that was burning energy in circles. This one was building. Roy laid out what he knew about the legal situation: property records, debt instruments, what could be verified at the county seat and what couldn't. Walt filled in the gaps in Colby's acquisition history with the particular precision of a man who had been paying attention for 30 years without anyone knowing he was doing it. Ben Garvey, who had lived in this valley longer than anyone at the table, provided names and histories and the specific quality of knowledge that only comes from watching the same piece of land through multiple generations of people trying to hold it. Pete didn't say much, but he listened with everything he had, and Clara noted that about him, the way the young man who'd laughed about his grandmother's knees was now sitting at a table with men twice his age, leaning forward, absorbing every word. People could surprise you. She'd always believed that, even when the evidence ran the other way. By 10 o'clock, they had the shape of a plan. By 11, they had the specifics. By midnight, when the fire had burned down to steady coals and the coffee pot was empty for the third time, they had assignments. Roy would ride to the county seat in the morning to pull property records, not just for Colby's acquisitions, but for every parcel in the valley, because you couldn't understand what someone was trying to build without seeing the full map. Walt would work his contacts, the old ranchers and the retired hands, and the men who sat in the barber shop on Saturday mornings and knew things that never made it into official records. Ben Garvey would send word to 2 families on the north end of the valley, people he'd known for decades, people who trusted him in the way that only long history buys. Pete and Sam and Miguel would spend the next 2 days riding to every damaged property and offering genuine practical help. Labor supplies, whatever Blackstone Ranch could spare, with no strings and no conditions, because the first thing you had to do before you could ask people to trust you was give them a reason to. Clara would coordinate it all. Nobody said that explicitly. Nobody assigned it to her or put her name to it in the way they put names to the other tasks. It just became clear, the way water finds its level, that she was the center of the thing. The person who held all the pieces and understood how they connected and could be trusted to keep track of what was happening in 4 directions at once. Roy looked at her across the table when the others had started drifting toward sleep, and he said very quietly, "This is a lot to carry." "I know," she said. "You don't have to." "Roy." She said his first name without thinking about it. It was the first time. He registered it, she saw it in his face, and didn't pull back from it. "I've been carrying things alone for 11 months. Carrying them with people is easier, not harder." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have given you people to carry things with a long time ago." "You didn't know I had anything worth carrying," she said. "Now you do." He looked at her with that new directness, the one that had started in the kitchen at 4 in the morning when the storm was at its worst, and he'd said how bad, and finally meant the question for her. "I'm not going to make that mistake again," he said. She believed him. Or she believed that he meant it right now, which was not quite the same thing, but it was enough to work with. She made him go to bed. She banked the fires herself, checked the lamp oil, looked in on Ben Garvey, who was asleep in the guest room, with the particular profound unconsciousness of a man who had been running on determination for 24 hours and finally let it go. She moved through the quiet house, in the way she always moved through it, noting, checking, attending to the things that didn't get done unless someone made them their business. She was the last one awake. She was always the last one awake. But tonight it felt different. Tonight the house around her wasn't the house of people who didn't see her. It was the house of people who were depending on her, which was a thing she understood how to carry. She'd been carrying it for most of her life. The only difference was that now they knew it too. She let herself sleep 4 hours. She was at the stove before anyone else was awake. The following 3 weeks moved at a speed that Clara hadn't experienced since the worst years of her marriage, when James was alive and sick, and the world required more of her than she'd known she had, and she'd discovered day by day that she had it anyway. Roy left for the county seat the morning after the planning session, and came back 2 days later with a saddlebag full of copied records and a face that confirmed everything they'd suspected. Colby owned 11 parcels in the valley. 11. Not the 3 or 4 that rumor had suggested. 11 assembled over 9 years through purchases so small and so spread out that no single transaction had seemed significant enough to notice. The corridor was real. The water source, if it was what Clara believed it was, sat at the exact center of it. She spread the copied records across the kitchen table, and she and Walt and Roy spent an evening reconstructing the map from what they had, and when they were done, the shape of what Colby was building was as clear as a brand on hide. 9 years, Roy said. He said it quietly, the way you say something when the number is too large to hold comfortably. Patient man, Walt said. He would have had the whole valley eventually, Roy said. Without the storm, without any of this, just slow and steady, and nobody connecting the dots, he would have gotten there. He still might, Clara said. If we don't move faster than he's expecting us to. Roy looked at her. What do you mean? He's patient, she said. But he's not used to being organized against. The families he's been approaching have been responding individually, each one making their own decision in isolation, under pressure, without knowing what the others are being offered. She straightened up from the table. That changes the moment they know they're not alone. That changes the moment someone shows them the map. Roy understood immediately. You want to call a meeting? I want to call a meeting, she confirmed. All the families. All of them. Show them the records. Show them the map. Let them see with their own eyes what the last 9 years have looked like from outside any single property. She looked at him. People make different decisions when they understand the full picture. Roy nodded slowly. When? End of the week. Here if you're willing. This is the largest kitchen in the valley, and people trust the food. She paused. That last part matters more than you might think. He almost smiled. I've learned not to underestimate what you think matters. The invitation went out the next morning. Pete and Sam and Miguel riding in 3 directions, carrying Roy's name. But Clara's words, which she'd dictated the night before, with the precision of a woman who knew that how you asked for something was nearly as important as what you were asking for. Not a warning. Not an emergency summons. An invitation to supper and a conversation about the valley's future from a neighbor who thought it was time they all talked. Most of the families said yes within a day. The ones who hesitated, Clara sent Walt to because Walt was 62 years old and looked like every grandmother's idea of a trustworthy man, and could sit in someone's parlor with a cup of tea and make a case with complete unhurriedness that was somehow more convincing than urgency. Franklin Colby heard about the meeting. Of course he did. A valley this size had no secrets that stayed secrets for more than 48 hours, and Colby had his ear closer to the ground than most. He sent Roy a note, polite, well-worded, the kind of note that managed to sound both friendly and threatening, without committing to either suggesting that stirring up the community over what was after all a series of routine property transactions was perhaps not in everyone's best interest. Roy read the note at the kitchen table with Clara standing at the stove, and Walt at his usual chair, and Pete leaning against the wall. He knows, Roy said. He was going to know, Clara said. We weren't trying to hide it. We were trying to move faster than he could respond to it. Are we? Roy looked up. Moving faster. The meeting is in 3 days and he's still writing polite notes, she said. Yes, we're moving faster. Roy folded the note and put it in his pocket. What if he shows up? Clara turned from the stove. He won't. A man like Colby doesn't show up to meetings he didn't call. He doesn't put himself in rooms where he can't control the conversation. She looked at Roy steadily. He'll send someone, though. Someone who looks like a neighbor and acts like a friend, and asks the kind of questions designed to create doubt. Pete straightened up from the wall. How do we handle that? The same way you handle any attempt to create doubt, Clara said. With facts. You show people the records. You put the map in front of them. You let the numbers speak. She went back to the stove. The truth is the most effective thing we have. It's also the thing Colby can't argue with because the records are public. We didn't invent them. We just assembled them in the same room. The night of the meeting arrived cold and clear, the way November nights in Montana arrive when they're being cooperative, which was not always. Clara had been cooking since 4 in the morning. Not because the food was the point, though it was important as she'd told Roy in ways that went past simple hospitality, but because cooking was how she thought, and she had a great deal to think about. 19 families came. More than she'd expected. More than Roy had expected, too. She could see it in the slight widening of his eyes when he came in from greeting the last arrivals in the yard. 19 families meant close to 60 people, and not all of them were ranchers. Some were townspeople, the blacksmith, the woman who ran the dry goods store, the doctor who had his practice above the feed store on the main street of Harlan Creek. People who understood that what happened to the ranches around a town happened to the town itself eventually. Clara moved through the crowd with coffee and food, and the specific invisibility she had always had in rooms full of people, which she was using now, the way she always used it, not as a limitation, but as a vantage point. She listened. She took in the temperature of the room, who was scared, who was angry, who was skeptical, who had already made up their mind in one direction, and who was genuinely uncertain. She filed it all away and moved on. Colby had sent someone. She spotted him within 10 minutes, a man named Garrett, who worked at the feed store and had a friendly face and a way of standing in groups that suggested he belonged while actually belonging to something else entirely. She'd seen his type before. She knew what he was there to do. She didn't say anything to Roy yet. There was a right moment for that, and this wasn't it. Roy opened the meeting with the directness that was the best thing about him. No preamble, no softening. Just the facts assembled in the order that made them clearest. He put the copied records on the table in the center of the room, and he put the map beside them. The map that Clara had spent 2 evenings reconstructing from the records, hand-drawn each of Colby's parcels marked clearly, and he let the room look at it. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people seeing something they hadn't known how to see before and suddenly understanding it completely. Eli Henderson said, "Lord Almighty." Ruth Henderson beside him said nothing. She just looked at the map with the face of a woman who has been told her instincts were right and finds no satisfaction in it whatsoever. Thomas Larkin said, "How long has this been going on?" 9 years, Roy said. The room moved. Not physically, but something shifted in it the way air shifts when a window opens somewhere, a change of pressure that everyone feels without being able to point to where it came from. Garrett moved at the edge of the crowd. Clara watched him drift toward a cluster of the more uncertain faces, the Perkins family, whose damage had been severe and whose debt had been real before the storm added to it. She watched him settle in beside them with the casual ease of a man who is very good at looking accidental. Clara slipped through the room and arrived beside the Perkins family from the other side. Ed Perkins was 45 thick through the middle, a man who had worked his land with dogged consistency for 15 years, and was now looking at the map with the expression of someone who has realized the ground under him is less solid than he thought. His wife Anne was beside him, her hands clasped in front of her, in the way women clasp their hands when they're containing something they don't want visible. Garrett was saying in a low, friendly voice, "Course records can be misleading. Property changes hands for all kinds of reasons. Don't necessarily mean what Mercer's suggesting it means." "What would you suggest it means?" Clara said, pleasantly, from the other side. Garrett looked at her. He hadn't noticed her arrive. She was used to that. "Just that context matters," he said, recovering smoothly. "Mr. Colby's been in this valley a long time. Been a good neighbor to a lot of folks. He came to your place the morning after the storm, Clara said to Ed Perkins. Not a question. She'd learned it from Ruth Henderson. Ed looked at her. He did, he said carefully. What did he offer you? Ed glanced at Anne. A married glance, the kind that carries a full conversation in half a second. He offered to buy, Ed said. Said he was offering fair value. What's fair value for your property? He told her. She looked at him steadily. That's about 35% below what comparable land in this valley sold for last spring. Garrett made a sound that was technically a laugh, but wasn't. Well, now land values after storm damage. The land isn't damaged, Clara said. The roof is damaged. A roof can be fixed. She was still looking at Ed Perkins, not at Garrett. Garrett wasn't the person who mattered in this conversation. How much would it cost to fix your roof? Ed said a number. Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the notebook she'd been carrying for 3 days and opened it and found the page she wanted and put it in front of Ed Perkins. That's what 4 ranches in this valley have already committed to contribute in labor and materials, she said, for exactly the kind of repair your roof needs. No purchase required, no debt. Neighbors helping neighbors the way this valley has always worked when it worked right. She paused. You don't have to sell your land to fix your roof, Mr. Perkins. You just have to ask. Ed Perkins looked at the notebook. He looked at his wife. He looked at the map on the table across the room where Roy was walking a group of ranchers through the property records, one parcel at a time. Garrett tried once more. Mr. Colby's offer isn't going to stay on the table indefinitely. Good, Ann Perkins said. Her voice was quiet and final, the voice of a woman who has been listening carefully and has made up her mind. She took her husband's arm. Ed, let's go look at that map. They walked away from Garrett without looking back. Clara watched them go. She let herself feel just for a moment the satisfaction of a thing done well. Then she put it away and moved on to the next cluster of uncertain faces, because the room was large, and the night was not infinite, and there was still a great deal of work to do. She spoke to 11 separate conversations that evening. In most of them, she said very little. She asked questions. She produced facts when facts were what the moment needed. She listened with the specific quality of attention that made people feel understood, rather than processed. In a few of them, she said a great deal because those conversations needed someone willing to say the thing plainly, and she had spent enough of her life not saying things plainly to have lost her patience with the habit. Garrett tried twice more to find purchase in the room, and each time something had already shifted in the conversation before he arrived. Clara wasn't managing this overtly. She wasn't following him exactly, and she wasn't steering people toward conclusions they hadn't reached themselves. She was simply making sure that the people who needed information had it, and that the information was accurate, and that the questions being asked were the right questions. The rest took care of itself. It was Walt who handled Garrett in the end, which was fitting. Walt settled himself next to the man in the quietest corner of the room at about the halfway point of the evening with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has nowhere particular to be, and all the time in the world, and he talked to Garrett for 45 minutes about Montana weather and cattle prices and the price of winter feed in bad years, and Garrett could not find a way out of the conversation without being obvious about it. And so he stayed and talked about weather and cattle and feed, and by the time he got free, the conversations he'd come to influence had already reached their own conclusions. Walt came to the kitchen to refill his cup afterward and found Clara at the stove. He didn't say anything. He just gave her that fractional nod. She gave it back. The meeting ended at 10 o'clock with something that had not existed in the valley 3 weeks ago. A loose but real agreement among 19 families to act together rather than apart. Not a formal organization, not a legal entity, not anything with a name yet. But an understanding built on a shared map and shared records and the specific solidarity of people who have seen the shape of what's being done to them and have decided together that they object. Roy shook hands at the door for the better part of an hour. Clara watched from the kitchen washing up, listening to the quality of those conversations. The firmness in people's voices, the absence of the scared undertone that had been there at the beginning of the evening. She filed that away too. Progress had a sound she'd learned over the years. This was it. The last guest left at 10:30. Ben Garvey, who had somehow become a fixture at Blackstone Ranch over the preceding weeks, and showed no particular signs of leaving. Not that anyone had suggested he should help Pete stack the chairs, while Walt sat at the table with the inevitable coffee, and Roy stood in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, looking at Clara with the thoughtful expression she'd come to recognize as his processing face. "Garrett," he said. "Colby's man," she confirmed. "You spotted him early." "Half hour in." Roy looked at her. "You didn't say anything." "The room didn't need me to say anything. The room needed me to make sure the right conversations happened before he could shape the wrong ones." She dried a dish. Saying his name out loud would have made him the center of the evening. "That's not where I wanted the center to be." Roy was quiet for a moment. "You managed an entire room full of people without any of them knowing you were doing it." "I was helping," she said, "not managing." "Is there a difference?" She considered that. "Managing is what you do when you know better than everyone else, and you're making sure it comes out the way you've decided it should. Helping is what you do when you trust that people will reach the right conclusion if they have the right information." She set the dish on the rack. "I don't know better than everyone else. I just pay attention better than most." Roy came into the kitchen properly, then not standing in the doorway but coming in, pulling out the chair across from where she was working, and sitting down. It was a small gesture. But in 11 months of her working in this kitchen, he had never done it. He had stood in the doorway, or sat at the head of the table in the main room, or moved through the kitchen on his way to somewhere else. He had never simply sat down across from her at the work table, as if it was a natural place to be. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. "I need to tell you something," Roy said. She kept washing dishes. "All right." "When I rode to the county seat to pull those records," he paused, "I asked about the spring, the water source you described, told the land surveyor what you'd found, what you'd observed. The grass, the drainage, the depth you got with the stick." She turned from the sink. He was looking at his hands on the table. He said, Roy looked up. He said, "If what you described is accurate, it's consistent with a primary aquifer access point." He said the kind of spring you're describing, if it's a primary source, would be significant. For irrigation. For the value of the land. He paused. For how much someone would want to control it. The kitchen was very quiet. "He said it might be the most significant water source in this part of the valley," Roy continued. "He said if Colby knows about it or suspects it, it would explain the entire 9 years of acquisitions." He looked at her directly. "Colby isn't building a land corridor, Clara. He's building around a water source. Everything else is secondary. The water is what he's after." Clara set down the dish towel. She sat down. She had known something like this was possible. She'd thought the spring was significant, but she'd been thinking about it in terms of what it meant for Blackstone Ranch: better irrigation, stronger grazing, a competitive advantage in dry summers. She hadn't followed the logic far enough. She hadn't asked what it meant to someone who'd known about it longer than she had and had been working toward it with the patience of 9 years. "He's known about the spring," she said. Not a question. "I think he suspected it, maybe more than suspected. Maybe he's had his own survey done." Roy's voice was steady, but his hands were not entirely still on the table. "Which means this property, my property, is not incidental to what he's building. You said that, but it's even more central than we thought." "He needs the water," Clara said. "Without it, the corridor is useful but limited. With it..." Roy shook his head. "With it, he controls the water supply for a significant portion of this valley's grazing land. He could charge for access. He could determine who can expand and who can't. He could effectively control ranching operations for miles in every direction without owning every parcel." Clara thought about the 9 years. The patience of it. The slow, careful assembly of pieces by a man who knew what the center was and was working his way toward it without ever moving fast enough to attract attention. "He's not going to stop," she said. No, Roy agreed. The meeting tonight bought time. It gave the Valley families a reason to hold together, but it didn't eliminate the problem. She was thinking fast the way she thought when the stakes clarified themselves. He's going to come back with something larger. Something that goes beyond individual offers to individual families. I think so too, Roy said. He'll try to reach people in ways that bypass the community solidarity we built tonight. Separate conversations, private pressure. He might call in debts if he has any leverage on specific families. She looked at Roy. Does he? Roy nodded slowly. Henderson borrowed against the Anchor Cross property 2 years ago when they had a bad season. I don't know who holds that note. I didn't think to check. Check, Clara said. Tomorrow, and find out if any other Valley families are carrying debt that could be called in. She paused. If Colby holds those notes, even 1 or 2 of them, he doesn't need to buy. He can foreclose. Roy stared at her. It's what I would do, she said. If I were him. If I were patient and methodical, and I'd seen a room full of people organize against me tonight. She met his gaze. I would look at every debt in this valley, and I would figure out which ones I could reach, and I would make sure those families understood that their choices had consequences. Roy pushed back from the table and stood up. I'll leave for town first thing. Wait, Clara said. He stopped. Don't go to the county clerk, she said. Not first. If Colby has people watching and he does a trip to the county records office the morning after the meeting, we'll tell him exactly what we're looking for. She looked at Roy steadily. Go to Thomas Larkin. He's the youngest brother, he's sharp, and he worked as a clerk in Billings for 2 years before he came back to the valley. He'll know how to read debt instruments, and he'll know how to find out who holds them without making it obvious that we're looking. Roy looked at her for a long moment. How do you know Thomas Larkin worked as a clerk in Billings? He told me, she said, the day we visited their property. He told me while you were talking to his brother about the root cellar. She paused. I was listening. Roy made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but held something of the quality of one recognition maybe, or the specific wonder of a man who keeps discovering that the person in front of him is 10 steps further along than he expected. He put on his hat. Clara, he said from the doorway. She looked up. I've been thinking about something. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, which was not his usual mode. Roy Hatch was a direct man. She'd always known that about him, even before he knew she was worth being direct toward. When this is settled, when Colby is handled, and the valley is stable, and the spring is properly surveyed, I want to change your position here. She looked at him, carefully. Not the cooking, he said quickly. Or not just the cooking. I mean... He stopped. Started again. I want you to be part of the decisions. Formally. Not in the kitchen listening to what gets said in the main room, and having to figure out how to be useful from a distance. At the table. In the room. He looked at her directly with the specific discomfort of a man who is doing something he knows he should have done a long time ago, and is only now finding the right way to do it. I want you to be part of running this ranch. The kitchen was very quiet. Walt had gone to bed. Pete and Sam and Ben were in the other room. The fire had burned low, and the lamp was giving steady light. And outside, the Montana cold was pressing at the walls the way it did in November, patient and immovable and entirely indifferent to what happened inside. Clara Whitlock looked at Roy Hatch across her kitchen table and thought about Wyoming and Idaho and 11 months of being invisible in this kitchen. And James, who had believed in her absolutely, and the spring she had found 400 yards east of the canyon, and the map on the table in the main room, and 19 families who had gone home tonight with something different in them than what they'd arrived with. She thought about all of that. Let's handle Colby first, she said. Roy nodded. He understood what that was, not a refusal, not a deflection, but a woman who had learned through long experience to hold good things carefully until they were real. He understood it because he was starting to understand her in the specific way that people understand each other when they've been through something serious together and survived it. First thing in the morning, he said. I'll have breakfast ready at 5, she said. And Roy. She used his first name again. It still landed differently than everything else. Take Walt with you. Whatever Thomas Larkin finds, Walt will know if it's significant in ways the paperwork might not make obvious. Roy pointed at her, which was a gesture she'd never seen him make before. Quick, definitive, the gesture of a man who recognizes a good instruction and commits to it immediately. Done, he said. He walked out. She listened to his boots on the stairs. She sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes, just her and the low fire, and the cleaned dishes, and the map still on the table in the main room. She could see one corner of it from where she sat, one edge of Colby's corridor carefully reconstructed from 9 years of records. Patient work. The work of a man who believed time was on his side. She thought about what the surveyor had said. Primary aquifer access point. Most significant water source in this part of the valley. She'd found that with a stick and 18 inches of digging on a slow afternoon when everyone else was busy and nobody was watching her. She'd found it because she was paying attention to the grass. Because she always paid attention. She wondered what else was out there on this land waiting to be found by someone who was willing to look. She got up. She banked the fires. She checked the lamps. She did her last walk of the house door's windows, the particular loose board on the second step that needed knowing about, so you didn't catch your foot on it in the dark. She had been doing this walk every night for 11 months, and she did it the same way she always did, thoroughly, unhurriedly, as if each thing she checked mattered, because it did. She was at the bottom of the stairs about to go up when Walt's voice came from the dark at the end of the hall. "Clara?" She stopped. Walt was sitting in the small chair by the back window, where he sometimes sat when he couldn't sleep, which was often. She hadn't seen him there. "Walt?" she said. "You should be in bed." "Got something to tell you," he said. She came down the hall. She stood in front of him. In 15 years of working ranches, Walt Decker had never looked at her the way he looked at her now, like something was bothering him that he should have said before, and was trying to figure out how the delay was going to land. "What is it?" she said. "Colby's surveyor," he said. "The one who did the valley survey 6 years back. Man named Jessup." He paused. "I know him. Worked with him once long time ago before he started working for people like Colby." Another pause. "Jessup doesn't do bad work." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying if Colby hired Jessup 6 years ago and Jessup did the survey, then Colby didn't just suspect the spring." Walt looked at her with those crow's feet eyes that had seen 40 years of things that mattered. He knew. Has known for 6 years. Every property acquisition after that point. He stopped. "Was specifically targeted," Clara finished. "Yes. Which means this isn't a man who stumbled onto a good opportunity," she said. "This is a man who has been methodically working toward a specific objective for 6 years, with a legal survey to guide him." She was quiet for a moment. "And if he has a survey that includes the spring—" "He may have a claim," Walt said, "depending on how the water rights were established and when. If Jessup's survey predates Roy's knowledge of the spring—" He stopped again. Clara sat down on this bottom step of the stairs. This was new information. This changed the shape of the problem in ways she needed to think about carefully before she could speak about them clearly. "Water rights," she said slowly. "In Montana, water rights are established by use and by filing," Walt said. "If Colby has had a survey identifying that spring for 6 years, and if he's filed any kind of claim—" "Has he? I don't know. That's what needs checking." Walt looked at her steadily. "That's more important than the property records. That's the thing Roy needs to find out in town tomorrow. Not just who holds the debt instruments. Whether Franklin Colby has a filed water rights claim on a spring that sits on Roy Mercer's land." Clara sat with that for a moment. A long moment. Then she stood up. "Wake Roy," she said. Walt raised an eyebrow. "I know it's past midnight," she said. "Wake him anyway. This doesn't wait until morning." Walt stood up slowly, the way he did everything, with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned that hurrying rarely got you there faster and usually cost you something. He went to the stairs. He paused. "You know," he said, I've worked with a lot of people in 40 years. Good ranchers, smart foremen, people who knew land and cattle and weather the way some people know music by ear, by feel, without having to think about it. He looked at her. I've never worked with anyone who could walk into a problem at any angle and find the thing that mattered in it the way you do. Clara looked at him. She was very tired, and the information about the water rights was still rearranging itself in her mind, and she did not have the composure right now to receive a compliment gracefully. "Go wake Roy," she said. Walt almost smiled. The full version. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went up the stairs. She went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on because whatever conversation was about to happen, it was going to need coffee. She moved through the familiar space, the stove, the counter, the shelf where the cups lived in the order she'd put them 11 months ago, and no one had ever rearranged. And she thought about water and rights, and a man with 9 years of patience and a 6-year-old survey, and a plan so careful and so quiet that it had been operating in plain sight, without anyone in this valley understanding what they were looking at. She thought about all of that. Then she thought he still doesn't have it. 6 years of planning and 9 years of acquisitions and the most significant water source in this part of Montana, and he still didn't have it. Because the land that held the spring belonged to Roy Mercer. Because Roy Mercer had in the last 48 hours finally started paying attention to who was paying attention for him. The kettle began to heat. Roy's footsteps came down the stairs, quick and unhesitating, a man who wakes fast and moves faster, which was a quality she'd needed him to have. She had the coffee ready by the time he reached the kitchen door. She told him about Jessup and the survey and the water rights without preamble, the way you tell someone something urgent, clean and direct, and all in one breath. She watched his face go from the slight confusion of a man woken past midnight to the particular hard focus of a man who has understood something important and is deciding what to do with it. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. "If he's filed a claim on that water," Roy said, "then the spring may not be entirely yours to use, regardless of where it sits on your property," Clara said. "Water rights in this territory don't automatically follow land rights. Whoever establishes prior claim." "Colby," Roy said. "Possibly. We don't know yet." She looked at him. "But Roy, if he has a filed claim, and we verify the spring's exact location, and it is on your land with his claim attached to it." "What?" "Then the most important thing we do tomorrow is not finding out who holds the debt instruments," she said. "The most important thing we do tomorrow is file our own claim." Roy looked at her. "Prior use and prior knowledge," she said. "I found that spring. I can testify to when I found it and what I observed. You can testify that you were unaware of Colby's claim. The question will be whether his filing date precedes what we can establish as your legitimate prior knowledge and use." She paused. "It's going to come down to dates and testimony and who a judge decides to believe." Roy was very still. "That's a legal fight." "Yes," she said. "That could take months." "Yes," she said again. "But the alternative is letting a water rights claim he may have filed quietly 6 years ago become the thing that gives him everything he's been building toward." She met Roy's eyes across the table. "You asked me to be part of the decisions, Roy. This is me being part of the decisions. We have to file tomorrow. First light." Roy Hatch sat across from Clara Whitlock in the kitchen of Blackstone Ranch at midnight, with Walt standing in the doorway, and the cold pressing against every wall, and the low fire giving its steady light. And he looked at the woman who had found a spring with a stick on a slow afternoon, who had seen a storm in the sky at 4:30 in the morning, who had managed a room full of frightened neighbors back toward solidarity without any of them knowing she was doing it. He looked at her and he said very quietly, "I'll be saddled before 5. She pushed his coffee cup toward him. "Drink that first," she said. "You'll need it." Roy rode out before the sun was fully up, Walt beside him on the gray gelding he'd been riding for 12 years and trusted more than most people. Clara watched them go from the kitchen window, the two of them moving through the cold dark at a pace that said they understood what was at stake and weren't wasting anything on ceremony. She turned back to the stove. There was work to do here too, and standing at windows watching men ride toward problems she'd identified was not how she was built. She'd done her part last night. Now she had to trust them to do theirs and keep the rest of the ranch running while they did. Pete was at the breakfast table by 5:30, with the particular alertness of a young man who had slept poorly because something important was happening, and his body hadn't wanted to miss it. He looked at the empty chairs where Roy and Walt usually sat, and then looked at Clara. "They went to town," she said before he could ask. "For the water rights." Pete wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "You think Colby really filed a claim?" "I think we need to know before he knows that we know," she said, "which means today." Pete nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in his hands. Then he said, "Miss Clara, what happens if the claim is already filed? What happens if we're too late?" She put a plate in front of him. "We deal with what's real when it's in front of us," she said. "Not before." He looked at her. He had been doing that more often lately, looking at her the way he looked at Walt, when Walt said something that required thinking about. She didn't comment on it. She just went back to the stove. Ben Garvey came in at 6 with his hat already on, and the expression of a man who had decided that sitting still was not an option today. "I want to ride into town," he said. "I know some people at the county clerk's office that Roy don't. Worked with the clerk's father back in the 70s. He looked at Clara with the directness of a man who had stopped pretending he wasn't asking for her permission, even if he would have denied it. "You think that's useful?" "I think that's very useful," she said. "Go, eat something first." He sat down and ate fast the way old men eat when they've remembered what it feels like to have somewhere important to be. And then he rode out after Roy and Walt with the particular purpose of a man who had nearly lost his land 2 weeks ago and had found in the loss of it a reason to fight he hadn't known he still had. The morning was quiet in the way that mornings are quiet when something is being decided somewhere else, and all you can do is hold your position and wait. Clara held hers. She cleaned the kitchen. She went through her provisions inventory, a habit now the way checking the sky at 4:30 was a habit, the kind of attention that had kept her alive and useful through years of being in places where no one was paying attention for her. She pulled numbers in her head. Winter was going to run long this year. She felt it in the same place she felt the storm coming, that deep body certainty that came from paying attention to things over time. She was calculating flower stores when Sam appeared at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that she had learned in 4 months meant he had something to say that he was working up to. "Miss Clara," he said. She looked at him. "The east fence," he said. "The one you told Mr. Roy about. The grade." He paused, arranging his English carefully. "I checked this morning. After the snow you can see it clearly. The low point." He looked at his hat. "It is exactly where you said." She nodded. "The post there," he continued. "Already leaning. Spring water will take it." He looked up. "I can begin moving the line. This week. Before the ground freezes harder." Clara looked at him for a moment. Sam had been on this ranch for 3 years. He had been doing exactly what she'd been doing, watching, noting, filing things away, without any more authority to act on it than she'd had. He'd been waiting for someone to say it mattered. "Yes," she said. "Do it. Take Miguel and whoever else you need." He put his hat on and went, and she watched him through the window as he crossed the yard with the straightforward energy of a man who has been given permission to do something he already knew needed doing. That was the thing she thought. That was what happened when you finally started listening to the people who had been watching. The knowledge had always been there. The capacity to act on it had always been there. The only thing missing was someone saying out loud that it counted. She was still at the window watching Sam organize Miguel and 2 other hands around the fence project when she heard horses coming up the approach. Fast. More than 2. She counted without thinking. 4 horses, moving at a pace that wasn't casual. She went to the door. Roy was in front, Walt beside him, Ben Garvey behind and with them. A 4th man she didn't know. thin mid-40s with the precise bearing of someone who worked with documents rather than cattle, and was not entirely comfortable on horseback. They came into the yard and Roy was off his horse before it had fully stopped, which was not like Roy, who was deliberate about horses, the way he was deliberate about most things. "Get inside," he said to Clara, and the tone of it not commanding but urgent. Carrying something she'd rarely heard in Roy Hatch's voice moved her through the door without needing to think about it. They came in after her, all four of them, and Roy pulled off his hat and looked at her and said, "Colby doesn't have a filed claim." She let out a breath. "Good. But Jessup's survey exists." Roy's voice was tight. "Our man here," he gestured at the fourth man who had come in last and was straightening his coat with the practiced composure of a professional. "This is Arthur Devlin. He's a land attorney from Billings. Ben knows him." Ben Garvey from behind Roy said, "Worked his father's case against a mining company 20 years back. Boy's good." Arthur Devlin looked at Clara with the assessing quality of a man who evaluates situations quickly and has decided in approximately 10 seconds where the relevant information in a room resides. He nodded at her with more respect than she'd expected. "Mr. Decker told me about you on the ride out," he said. "He told me you found the spring." "I did," she said. "When August of this year, second week. You documented it." She looked at him steadily. "I wrote it in my personal journal the evening of the same day I found it," she said, "with the date, the location as I measured it, and what I observed." She paused. "I also told Walt about it the following morning." Walt from his chair said, "She did." Arthur Devlin looked at Roy, then back at Clara. "That's prior documentation," he said, "dated before any filing Colby could now make. If he tries to file a claim going forward, your documentation establishes prior knowledge and prior observation." He paused. "It doesn't give you full water rights automatically, that's more complicated, and I won't lie to you about that, but it makes his position considerably weaker than it would be if you had nothing." "What does he have?" Clara asked. "Jessup's survey," Arthur said, "which documents the spring's existence and approximate location as of 6 years ago. But a survey is an observation, not a claim. He didn't file, whether that was oversight or strategy." He paused. "My read is strategy. He didn't want the filing on record because it would show his hand before he was ready. He was waiting until he owned the surrounding land," Clara said. "Once he controlled the corridor, the filing would have been a formality. Nobody left to contest it." Arthur Devlin looked at her with the expression of a man who has just had something confirmed that he suspected but needed to hear said aloud. "That is exactly right," he said. "So file now," Clara said. "Roy files today with my journal entry as supporting documentation and Walt as witness to prior disclosure. We establish the claim before Colby can." "That's the recommendation," Arthur confirmed. "I've brought the paperwork. If you're willing to ride back to town this afternoon with me, Mr. Mercer, we can have it filed before the clerk's office closes." Roy looked at Clara. That look again, the one that was asking something it didn't have words for. "Your journal," he said. "You'll let us use it." "It's documentation of something on your land," she said. "Of course I will." "Clara," he stopped. "If we file this claim and Colby contests it, you'll be named in the proceeding, as the person who documented it. He'll know your name." She met his eyes. "Roy, Franklin Colby has been in this valley for 9 years buying land from people who didn't know what he was doing with it. He came to your door the morning after the worst storm in 11 years to try to buy a property he'd been circling for 6 years. He sent a man to a community meeting to try to undermine the people you invited there." She held Roy's gaze. "I think we are past worrying about whether Franklin Colby knows my name." Walt made that sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Ben Garvey behind everyone said something under his breath that sounded like agreement. Roy looked at her for another long moment. Then he said simply and completely, "All right." They filed at 3:15 that afternoon. Clara wasn't there. She was at the ranch, managing the endless practical work of a property in November that needed constant attention, regardless of what legal proceedings were unfolding in town. But Roy told her about it when he came back in more detail than she'd expected. The way a man tells a story to someone he knows will understand its significance. The clerk had asked who'd found the spring. Roy had said the woman who ran his kitchen. The clerk, a man in his 60s named Morrison, who had been processing land claims in this county for 30 years, had looked up from his paperwork and said in a tone that was almost but not quite surprised, "Well, someone's been paying attention." Roy told her that part twice. She let herself feel it for a few seconds. Then she went back to the potatoes she was peeling. That was the 16th of November. Colby's response came on the 21st. Not a legal challenge, not yet. That would come, Arthur Devlin had told them, and they should be ready for it. What came first was a visit, and it came in the form of Franklin Colby himself, riding up the approach to Blackstone Ranch at 10 in the morning on a clear, cold Tuesday, with 2 men behind him, and the specific confidence of a person who has decided to handle something personally. Clara was in the kitchen. She heard the horses and counted them, and stayed where she was. Roy met Colby in the yard. She could hear their voices through the kitchen window, not words, not reliably, but the shape of the conversation. Roy's voice steady and level. Colby's voice doing that thing she'd heard from his note, the pleasant, threatening quality, the tone of a man who has a great deal of power and is choosing for now to wear it lightly. It went on for several minutes. Then Roy's voice changed. Not louder. Roy didn't get loud, but harder. The way a fence post is hard, the specific immovability of a thing that is what it is and will not be argued into being something else. Then, silence. Then Colby's horses in the yard turning. Then Roy coming through the kitchen door. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with a face that was doing the complicated thing, the one she'd never had a word for, and now was starting to think the word for might be resolve. "He says our filing won't hold," Roy said. "That's his legal position," Clara said. "Not necessarily the correct one. He says Jessup's survey gives him standing that predates our claim. Arthur says it doesn't because a survey isn't a claim." She looked at Roy steadily. "What else did he say?" Roy was quiet for a moment. "He said you were overstepping." He watched her face. "He knows about the planning meeting. He knows about the ride we took to the Valley properties. He knows what you said to Ed Perkins and his wife." Roy paused. "He specifically said..." He stopped. "Say it," Clara said. "He said he had no quarrel with me," Roy said carefully. "He said the problem was the people I was getting advice from who didn't have standing to give it." The kitchen was very still. Clara set down the knife she was holding. She set it down carefully on the counter with deliberate precision. "What did you say?" "I told him," Roy said, and his voice had that hard fence post quality to it, "that the people who advise me on my property and my business are my business, and his opinion on the subject has no standing of any kind." He paused. "And then I told him to get off my land." Clara looked at Roy Hatch. She had been looking at this man for over a year, across a kitchen she worked in, across a table she served food at, across a yard she crossed twice daily. She had watched him be capable and efficient, and sometimes careless, and often unaware of what was happening 3 feet to his left. She had watched him change over the course of 2 weeks that had turned out to matter more than the 11 months before them. She looked at him now and saw someone she recognized. Not because he was new, he wasn't. Because he had become fully what he'd always had the capacity to be. "Good," she said. She picked up the knife. "Sit down. Breakfast is in 10 minutes. He sat down. Walt came in from wherever Walt appeared from and poured his own coffee and sat at the far end of the table. Pete came in behind him and Ben Garvey after that, and they all sat around the table in the kitchen, that was Clara's kitchen, and waited for the food she put in front of them, and nobody said anything about Colby for a while because sometimes the right response to a thing done right is just to sit with it and eat. What followed was 6 weeks that Clara would later think of as the building weeks. Not because anything dramatic was happening, but because the work of making something real required the unglamorous, sustained effort of people showing up day after day and doing what they said they were going to do. Sam finished moving the fence line. He did it in 4 days, working in the cold with the focused efficiency of a man who has been waiting to do something correctly for a long time. And when he was done, Clara walked the new line with him and nodded and told him it was well done and meant it, and Sam put his hat back on and went back to work without ceremony, which was exactly how Clara would have handled it herself. Arthur Devlin filed the additional supporting documentation: Clara's journal, Walt's signed statement, a surveyor Roy hired to properly document the spring's location and flow. The counter-documentation to Jessup's survey took 2 weeks to prepare, and was, Arthur told them, as solid as these things got before a judge. The Valley families held together. Not perfectly. There were wobbles. Moments of pressure when Colby or his people found a way to reach someone alone and make the fear feel bigger than the community. The Perkins family had 3 bad days in the second week of December when a bill came due that they hadn't expected, and the pressure of it, combined with Colby's ongoing presence at the edges of things, made Ed Perkins ride over to Blackstone Ranch in the late afternoon, looking like a man who was trying to find a reason to give up. Clara sat with him in the kitchen for an hour. She didn't talk much. She let him say what he needed to say, the fear, the exhaustion, the specific weight of trying to hold something together when the holding felt impossible. She poured his coffee, and she listened, and when he was done, she said plainly and without drama, "What does the bill need?" He told her. She told him how much labor Blackstone Ranch could provide toward his spring repairs, which were the thing the bill was actually about. And she told him Walt knew a man at the bank in town who had dealt fairly with ranchers in the past and might be willing to restructure the terms. She told him what 3 other Valley families had offered to contribute to the collective repair effort and hadn't been claimed yet because nobody had gotten around to matching the offers with the needs. "You've been tracking all of this," Ed said. He said it the way Thomas Larkin had said it, the way Ruth Henderson had said it, with the slightly stunned quality of people discovering that someone has been paying attention to things they didn't know anyone was watching. "Someone has to," Clara said. Ed Perkins looked at her for a long moment. He had the face of a man doing arithmetic and finding that the numbers came out differently than he'd expected. "My wife said after the meeting..." He stopped. "She said you were the one who actually held that room together. Not Roy. Not Walt." He paused. "She said she didn't know your name before that night." "Most people didn't," Clara said. "That's..." He shook his head. "That ain't right." "No," she agreed. It wasn't. He rode home in better shape than he'd arrived in. She watched him go and turned back to her kitchen and kept working. The legal challenge came on December 14th. Arthur Devlin rode out to tell them in person, which Clara appreciated. It was the kind of news that deserved to be delivered face to face. Colby had filed a counterclaim to the water rights. The basis was Jessup's survey establishing prior knowledge. The argument Arthur explained at the kitchen table with Roy and Walt and Clara present was that Colby's documented awareness of the spring's existence 6 years prior constituted a form of prior claim sufficient to contest Roy's filing. "Is that going to work?" Pete asked from his increasingly permanent position at the edge of important conversations. "It's a stretch," Arthur said. "In Montana, water law documented awareness isn't the same as filed claim. But it's not frivolous. Colby has a competent lawyer, which I suspected, and the argument has enough form to it that a judge will need to rule on the substance." He paused. "The hearing is scheduled for February." February. 3 months. Clara looked at the table. She thought about 3 months of Colby's pressure on the Valley, 3 months of uncertainty, 3 months of fear, as a tool against people who didn't have the reserves to absorb extended strain. "He's counting on the winter," she said. Arthur looked at her. "The hearing is in February," she said. "That's not coincidental. That's 3 months for the Valley families to wear down, for the fear to compound, for the bad days to accumulate until people start making decisions based on how tired they are rather than what's actually true." She looked at Arthur. He thinks by February he won't need the water rights claim to get what he wants. He thinks some portion of these families will have sold by then. Arthur said nothing. Will they? Roy asked. Clara thought about Ed Perkins and his bill. She thought about the Larkin brothers and their ruined root cellar. She thought about the 19 families at the meeting. The fear underneath the solidarity, the specific fragility of people trying to hold together under sustained pressure when they'd never had to do it quite this way before. Some of them might, she said honestly. If we leave them to manage alone, some of them will. She looked at Roy. So we don't leave them to manage alone. That became the work of December. Not dramatic work. Not the kind that had a moment you could point to and say, there, that's where it turned. The quiet, unremarkable daily work of showing up. Roy and Pete and Sam rode the valley in rotation, not to deliver speeches or organize meetings, but to provide specific practical help. The labor for the Perkins repairs, the winter feed the Henderson family needed, the structural assessment of Ben Garvey's roof that finally confirmed it could be repaired rather than rebuilt, which was the difference between manageable and impossible. Clara coordinated all of it from the kitchen. She tracked what each family had and what each family needed and matched them to each other with the unsentimental efficiency of a woman who had been doing this kind of invisible infrastructure work her entire life, and had simply never before been given permission to do it at scale. She sent food when food was the thing that mattered. A pot of beans delivered by Pete on a Tuesday, cornbread and salt pork on a Friday. She sent information when information was the thing. The name of the banker Walt trusted, the specific county records Thomas Larkin had found that clarified the Perkins debt situation, the wording of the collective agreement she'd written out by hand that gave the Valley families a way to formalize their mutual commitments without requiring a lawyer. That last thing the collective agreement became in the weeks before Christmas, the thing Clara was most proud of and least likely to talk about. It was one page. It said simply and specifically that the families whose names appeared at the bottom agreed to share labor information and resources through the winter of 1888 to 1889 and beyond, on the understanding that a community held together was more valuable than any individual property held apart. 14 families signed it. She didn't sign it herself. She had no property, no standing, no legal position in the valley. But she wrote it, and that felt like enough. Roy read it when she put it in front of him and looked at her and said, "This is going to matter." He said it simply without drama, the way he said things when he was most certain. "Sign it," she said. He signed it. He signed. Christmas came cold and bright, and Clara made a meal for 14 people at Blackstone Ranch, the Hands and Ben Garvey and Walt, who had no family left to go to, and Pete's mother, who rode in from town and looked around the kitchen with the discerning eye of a woman who understood what a kitchen told you about who ran it, and found apparently that she approved of what she saw. Roy sat at the head of the table, and for the first time in the nearly 13 months Clara had been at this ranch, the table felt full, in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people sitting at it. After supper, when the others had moved to the main room and she was cleaning up alone, Roy came back to the kitchen. He came back the way he always came back now, without ceremony, pulling out the chair at the work table and sitting down as if it was the most natural thing in the world, which it had become. He put an envelope on the table. She looked at it. "What's that?" "Open it." She wiped her hands and picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, a formal document county stamped with her name on it. She read it once, and then read it again, and then set it down on the table and looked at Roy. "That's a partnership agreement," he said. "Blackstone Ranch operating as a partnership between Roy Mercer and Clara Whitlock. Equal decision-making authority on ranch operations, water management, and land use. A salary commensurate with the position." He paused. Arthur drew it up. "It's legal and binding, and it means what it says." She looked at the document. She looked at Roy. "You said end of the week," he said. "When I mentioned changing your position, you said handle Colby first. We've handled Colby as much as he's going to be handled before February. It's Christmas." He held her gaze. I'm asking. There was a long silence. Clara thought about Wyoming. She thought about James with his absolute belief in her, and the 10 years since without it. She thought about 11 months of being furniture, and 2 weeks of being seen, and 6 weeks of doing the most meaningful work she'd done since the years when James was alive, and the world required everything she had. She thought about the fence line Sam had moved, and the spring that was now documented, and the 14 families holding together through a Montana winter, and the room that had changed the night she'd stopped trying to make Roy listen, and started doing what needed doing. She thought about all of it. Then she picked up Roy's pen from the table where he'd set it, and she signed her name to the document. Roy exhaled just slightly, just enough to tell her he'd been holding his breath. She noticed that the way she noticed everything, and she filed it carefully in the place where she kept the things that mattered. Arthur also thinks we have a strong case for February, Roy said after a moment. I know, she said. The judge assigned to the case is a woman named Harriet Crane, he said. First woman on the bench in this county. Clara looked up. Arthur says she has a particular interest in cases where documented expertise has been overlooked or undervalued based on circumstances unrelated to merit. Roy's voice was even, but there was something in it, something she'd only recently learned to read. Warmth. That was the word. Roy Hatch, who ran warm the way granite runs warm, not obviously not easily, but genuinely underneath everything. He thinks she'll find our documentation compelling, both the legal documentation and... He paused. The rest of it. The story of how the spring was found, and by whom, and what happened after. The story of the cook, Clara said. The story of the woman who found the most significant water source in this valley with a stick on a slow afternoon, Roy said, because she was paying attention when no one else was. She was quiet for a moment. That's a good story, she said. It's a true story, he said. She stood up and started on the last of the dishes. Roy stayed at the table, the way he'd been staying at the table more and more lately, and they were quiet together in the kitchen, the way people are quiet together when the quiet itself is a kind of conversation. Roy, she said after a while. The pasture rotation in the west section. I want to start the new plan in March soon as the ground allows. Sam knows what needs doing, I've talked to him about it. But it needs authorization. Done, Roy said. And the spring survey, Arthur's surveyor said the flow rate suggests it could support irrigation for the northeast quarter. I want to look at what that means for the summer grazing plan. Done, Roy said again. And, she paused. Clara. What? Whatever else is on the list. Roy said, it's done. All of it. That's what the piece of paper means. She turned from the sink and looked at him. He was sitting at the work table with his coffee going cool in front of him and his hat off and his face in the lamplight doing nothing complicated, which was new. Just settled, like a man who has finally arrived somewhere he should have been a while ago and has enough sense to recognize it. Merry Christmas, Roy, she said. Merry Christmas, Clara, he said. She turned back to the dishes. Outside, Montana was doing what Montana did in December, cold and vast and indifferent, the way the land always was, the way it would always be, making no promises and offering no apologies, and asking only that the people who wanted to live on it pay attention. Clara had been paying attention for 40 years. She intended to keep going. February came, and the hearing came, and Arthur Devlin stood before Judge Harriet Crane with the journal and Walt's testimony, and the survey, and the collective agreement signed by 14 Valley families, and Franklin Colby's lawyer made his arguments about Jessup's survey and prior knowledge, and the judge listened to both sides with the careful attention of someone who understood that what was being decided was bigger than a water rights claim. It took her 4 days to rule. Roy read the ruling at the kitchen table with Clara beside him and Walt at the far end, and Pete standing in the doorway, which was where Pete always stood when something important was happening, as if he wanted to be close enough to see it, but still had some old reflex that said, important things happened to other people. The ruling was 3 pages. Roy read it aloud straight through without stopping. Colby's claim was denied. The court found that an undisclosed survey, not accompanied by a filed claim, did not constitute prior right in Montana water law. The court further found that Clara Whitlock's documented observation, witnessed and dated, established Blackstone Ranch's legitimate prior claim to the spring and its water. The court further noted, and this was the part Roy read twice, his voice doing something careful, that the manner in which this claim had come to light and the broader pattern of events in this valley over the preceding winter demonstrated with particular clarity that the most reliable information in any community is often held by the person whom that community has been trained not to ask. Walt said, Pete said, Lord Almighty. Clara read the ruling herself quietly from the beginning. She read the whole thing. She read the part Roy had read twice, and then she folded it and set it on the table and looked at the window where March was doing what March in Montana does, trying to be spring, and not quite managing it yet, too cold for optimism, but past the worst of the dark. She thought about the cook. She thought about the woman nobody listened to. She thought about what it cost to know things that nobody would hear, and to keep knowing them anyway, and to keep working anyway, and to keep showing up to kitchens where you were, furniture and skies that were telling you the truth, that nobody else was reading in land, that was giving up its secrets to anyone patient enough to kneel down with a stick. She thought about Walt saying, I reckon that's going to change. It had. She stood up and went to the stove because there was food to make and a ranch to run and a spring that needed a proper irrigation plan, and 14 Valley families who were going to need the same consistent, unglamorous daily attention. They'd need it all winter, and all of it was hers to do now. Not invisibly, not sideways, not from the kitchen doorway watching the room she wasn't allowed to enter. Roy came to stand beside her at the stove, not across from her, not in the doorway, but beside her, and he said, What do you need? She looked at the spring survey on the counter. She looked at the pasture rotation plan she'd drafted in January. She looked at the fence assessment Sam had given her, and the water table notes from Arthur's surveyor, and the collective agreement that 14 families had signed, and the legal ruling that said her name, Clara Whitlock, in a court of law, in a territory where her name had never mattered to anyone with authority before. She looked at all of it. I need a larger table, she said. Roy laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh fully, without reservation, with his whole chest in it. It was a good sound. I'll build you one, he said, and he did. Blackstone Ranch entered its most successful season in years that spring, the northeast quarter irrigated for the first time by the spring. Clara had found with a stick on a slow August afternoon the west pasture rotated back to health, the fence line holding where Sam had moved it before the flood. The valley held together through Franklin Colby's one final attempt to buy out the weakest properties in April, and then held some more. And then Colby sold his corridor parcels to the county for a road project in June, and that was the end of that. Ben Garvey's roof was rebuilt in May by 8 men and 2 women from 4 Valley families, and when they were done, Ben Garvey stood in his yard and looked at it and said in the voice of a man who has been given something back that he thought was gone, That's a good roof. Ruth Henderson brought pie. Clara brought cornbread, and the knowledge filed and noted and dated that this was what a community looked like when it decided to be one. She still cooked. She'd never stopped cooking. She loved it, had always loved it the way you love the thing you're genuinely made for. She cooked for the ranch, and she managed the ranch, and she sat at the new table Roy built in the kitchen, larger than the old one with chairs on all sides, and the conversations that happened at that table were the real conversations, the ones about the land, and the water, and the future, and the next problem, and the one after that. Walt sat at the far end in his usual chair and drank his coffee and said things when things needed saying, which was exactly right. Pete sat somewhere in the middle and listened more than he talked now, which was better than the grin which was still there but had learned to mean something. Sam sat at the table when there was something to discuss about the land, because Sam had earned it the night he went back out into the blizzard and held a roof section with his hands, and everybody knew it. Roy sat across from Clara and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the morning after the storm, when he'd finally learned to see her directly without filtering her through what she was supposed to be, just looking at what she actually was. And Clara sat at the table she'd asked for in her kitchen, in her ranch, in her valley in the Montana spring. And she spoke, and people heard her, and she knew things, and people acted on them. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she had always been capable of doing, in a place that had finally learned to ask. The most valuable voice in that valley had always been the one nobody thought to listen to. She had been there the whole time. She had never stopped paying attention. And now, at last, neither had anyone else.